Hey guys, welcome to part 5 of What If Hokage Naruto Went Back in Time to Fix His Mistakes. If you enjoy the video then like, share and subscribe and also comment your thoughts as it inspires me to make more such videos, and remember to check out my playlist section for other interesting stories. So let's get started. Chapter 7 Part 2. And being the clueless idiot he had been, he had completely missed the Hyuga heiress affections, but perhaps that was best. Things had turned out fine in the future and Hinata had found her own love in the end. Naruto's team is just as bad. Probably worse, Haruki told her cheerfully. He and Sasuke are similar and different in so many ways. Those two fight all the time. If it wasn't for Sakura, they'd be at each other's throats every 5 minutes. Half the time, I'm surprised Sakura doesn't go insane having to deal with those two all the time. An unexpected giggle slipped out and Hinata quickly clapped a hand over her mouth. But Haruki only laughed softly, one hand giving her a soft pat on the shoulder. Don't worry. Laugh at them all you want. Those two are a comedy show all on their own. This time, the giggles came more freely and Hinata found herself smiling openly for the first time in a long while. She hesitated for a moment, glancing between the boys and her temporary sensei before asking shyly, what do you think I should do? About them. Haruki heed thoughtfully, inwardly dancing on the inside. Well, you could try yelling at them. He grinned at the horrified expression on Hinata's face. Hey, it would definitely work. You could shock them into compliance. But I suppose that's not your style. He paused, glancing down at the kunoichi again. What do you think you should be doing right now? Hinata looked around nervously before activating her Byakugan and scanning their surroundings again. She had caught a glimpse of something that looked like a path and she concentrated in that direction now. Yes, she could still see it. There was nothing blocking her Byakugan this time and she could see right through the buildings blocking her way. Deactivating her Byakugan again, she glanced brightly up at Haruki, forgetting her reticence as she piped up excitedly, I found it. I can see the way. Haruki quirked a smile at her as he nodded. Okay then. You're already one up your teammates. Now you just have to get them to listen. He reached out to give the Hyuga heiress a gentle push forward when she remained frozen in place. You're constantly changing at your own pace and you're fine just the way you are. What you want to become, what you want to prove, you already have the strength to do both. All you have to do is find it in yourself and take the leap. Now go on. Show them what you can do, Hinata-chan. Hinata watched as the Junin gave her a last smile before melting into a nearby alleyway, a mixture of hope and disbelief forming a hard lump in her throat. That was the first time anyone had ever told her she could do something. But what could Haruki see in her? She turned back to stare at her teammates, one still shouting, the other doing his best to ignore him. You're constantly changing at your own pace and you're fine just the way you are. What you want to become, what you want to prove, you already have the strength to do both. All you have to do is find it in yourself and take the leap. Hinata pressed her lips together before straightening her shoulders. She didn't want to stay like this forever. She wanted to get stronger. And if she already had the potential to do that, then the only thing stopping her right now was herself. Taking a deep breath, Hinata marched forward, coming to a stop just a few steps behind her two teammates. Kiba-kun. She frowned when her voice came out barely above a murmur. That wouldn't do. If she wanted them to listen to her, then she'd have to speak up. She winced when Kiba reached out to grab Shino. That probably wouldn't be a good idea. Kiba-kun. Shino-kun. Stop fighting. Her voice almost cracked at the end, but Hinata determinedly held the volume until the very last word. To her shock, both boys froze, heads snapping in her direction with shock evident on even Shino's face. She flushed but kept her head up defiantly when she remembered Haruki's words. I found the path Haruki-san left for us. Hinata forced the stammer out of her words as much as she could. Shino-kun, Haruki-san gave us this mission as a team. I think it would be best to stick together. Kiba-kun, don't get mad at everything Shino-kun does. You both specialize in tracking. You have your way and Shino-kun has his. Wouldn't we finish this mission even faster if you two work together? Hinata felt her clenched hands tremble just a little by the end of her monologue. She had never spoken so much at one time. Actually, she was pretty sure she had never spoken so much in a day. Both her teammates were staring at her as if she had suddenly grown a second head, and Hinata fought the urge to shrink away and look down, staring resolutely back at the boys. Surprisingly, Shino was the first to capitulate, shoulders suddenly losing their tensed slant and his entire countenance regaining their previous stoicism. If you have found the path Haruki-san designated for us, Shino muttered, then it is logical to stay together. Kiba couldn't quite tear his eyes off his female teammate. What the heck had happened to Hinata? Where was the shy, timid girl he knew as his teammate? At the moment, all he could see was a subtle ferocity in Hinata's face, almost daring him to argue with her. He managed, rubbing the back of his neck as his expression turned sheepish. Well, if you know which way to go, then staying together sounds good. Hinata brightened visibly. They listened to her. Was this all she had to do? Give them something important enough that they would see the value of sticking together as a team. Oh, okay then, she stammered out when she noticed that both boys' attentions were still glued on her. Let's go this way. I think we're heading towards the V village's gates. Hinata turned and began walking, stamping down the urge to check if they would follow. She found herself smiling when she heard the shuffle of footsteps fall into step behind her. Maybe she could do something if she tried. XX. Asuma was right. You're great with children. Haruki snorted, perched at the edge of a rooftop. Kurenai, it was touch and go for a while there. I'm not used to talking to girls like Hinata. Until the last moment, I still hadn't decided how I was going to get through to her. Kurenai blinked, leaning forward curiously. Undecided. What would you have done instead if not that? Haruki shrugged before grinning wryly. Got her mad. Insulted her until she got pissed enough to yell back at me. Haruki raised his hands in a placating gesture at the appalled look on the kunoichi's face. Hey, don't look at me like that. I know people that just won't respond unless I piss them off. Like Anko. Kurenai shot back huffily. Not Hinata. I would have punched you if you had picked that method. The redhead rubbed the back of his head awkwardly. Good thing I didn't then, huh? Kurenai just rolled her eyes before nodding at her students. Let's go then. They're almost at the gates. XX. Katetsu perked up from his slumped position at the wooden desk when he caught sight of three distant figures making their way toward them. Hey, they're coming. Azumo rolled his eyes but couldn't help straightening up as well. Gate duty was damn boring when there wasn't anything going on and damn annoying when there was. Either way, it wasn't the best job in the world. You think they'll ask us? Katetsu leaned forward impatiently, peering at the approaching genin. Maybe we should give them a hint. Azumo couldn't suppress an exasperated sigh as he reached out and yanked his partner back into his seat. Would you stop that? With the way you're acting, you might as well be waving a red flag at them. Besides, Haruki said they'd get it. We're supposed to give them the hint after they come to us, not give them a hint to get the real hint. Katetsu huffed but settled back down in his chair. He had been bored all morning and it was already nearing midday. There hadn't been so much as an ant crossing into Konoha. No one could blame him for being a little excited. When Haruki had approached them at 6:30 this morning looking like death warmed over, they had immediately inquired after his health. The redhead had assured them that he was fine and had just had a late night, looking almost puzzled at their concern. The two of them had been hard-pressed not to call Yugo up immediately and have the woman drag Haruki to the hospital. The man looked like Hayate on a bad day. But before they could make up their minds, Haruki had launched into a brief explanation of the training exercise he had in mind for Kurenai's genin team and had asked them if they wanted to help. Neither of them needed any time to think on it and agreed immediately. The makeshift mission sounded entertaining and would make their day more interesting. Genins are kinda slow, Katetsu commented in a low voice and Azumo held back the urge to whack him over the head. They're just starting, he whispered back. What did you expect? Katetsu shuffled his feet as he watched the group draw closer. They could at least walk faster. And how exactly was that dog supposed to pick up on all the chakra threads if it was sitting on top of the boy's head? And he couldn't see a single kikaichu flying around either. He squinted at them and willed them to walk faster. They stopped and looked around. Katetsu twitched and growled, Damn, they're either not that bright or, well, not that bright. An elbow in his ribs made him grunt. Azumo glared irately at his partner. If you don't shut up, I'm going to knock you out and do our part by myself. His voice bordering on a whine, Katetsu retorted, come on, Zumo. We could have done this when we were genin. Azumo gave him a pointed look. You sucked at sensing chakra signatures. How would you have found the chakra threads? Katetsu grinned at his partner. You were amazing at sensing chakra. I'd just ask you. Anyway, Kurenai's team have an Aburame and an Inazuka, plus the Hyuga. They should be rushing through this with no problem. Azumo just heaved another sigh but didn't bother arguing back. Prolonged arguments with Katetsu usually resulted in headaches. The man just didn't give. Hey, they're moving again. They're coming this way. Act normal. Azumo could feel a tick developing over one eye as he tried not to slam his head into the wooden table. Aboard Katetsu was a stupid and mildly hyperactive Katetsu. He aimed a kick at his partner's shin. Settle down. He snapped as best he could without raising his voice. If anyone needs to look normal, it's you. Calm down, idiot. Azumo turned to glance at the genin as Katetsu obeyed somewhat reluctantly and settled back again, shifting occasionally in his seat. He glanced down at one hand and flexed it. He was no puppeteer and sending out chakra threads wasn't something he did on a regular basis, but it was challenging enough to be fun. Maybe he would try to lead them astray. Haruki had said they could do anything they want. The trail ends here. Hinata stopped to look around. The main gates loomed in front of them but there wasn't anything eye-catching within sight. Shino glanced around, noting the two chunin on gate duty. He frowned. One of them looked excited. Silently, he directed his bugs out. They were back within seconds, relaying their conversation to him. He took a step towards the two shinobi before stopping to consider his options. And then, with a mental sigh, he turned back to his two teammates. My Kikaichu say that those two chunin are part of this mission. They will direct us to our next destination. Kiba's jaw dropped open, blinking in surprise at his teammate. Did Shino just offer up information of his own free will? Hinata smiled timidly at the older boy. Thanks for telling us, Shino-kun. I guess we should go ask them. Kiba closed his mouth with a click and offered a wary grin at the bug user. Alright then. Let's go see what they know. A minute later, they were assembled in front of the two suddenly bored-looking shinobi, and like always, Kiba spoke up first, bounding up to the wooden desk with his usual enthusiasm. Hi. Did Haruki-san, Junin, red hair, blue eyes, did he come by? The two chunin exchanged a disinterested glance. Or at least tried to. The one on the left suddenly made a face and broke out into a grin. Okay. I can't do this, he announced as the chunin on the right face palmed. Come on Zumo, what am I supposed to do? I can't treat a bunch of genin like they're foreign nincome to visit. The shinobi on the right snapped, looking annoyed. No one told you to. We're supposed to pretend we don't know anything until they give us enough proof that they know what they're doing. The first chunin shrugged and turned back to them. They asked about Haruki. That's good enough for me. Now let's get started. The second chunin sighed and gave up, casting a critical eye over them. Kiba exchanged bemused expressions with his fellow teammates. What could these two possibly tell them? Couldn't they just point them in the right direction? Alright then, here's the deal. Katetsu stood up and came out from the station. Azumo, that's him by the way, and I'm Katetsu. We're going to send out chakra threads toward certain parts of the village. Your job is to follow the right thread to find Haruki. And Kurenai I suppose. Understand? Azumo frowned over at his partner as he also stood up. I seem to recall longer instructions, Katetsu. He turned back to the genin. There will be 2 correct threads among 20. One will lead you straight to them while the other will lead you back to us eventually and then you'll be able to follow the other one to find them. The 2 correct threads will have the most amount of chakra put into it. Any questions? All 3 genin shook their heads. Katetsu and Azumo exchanged a glance before turning simultaneously towards the rest of the village, spread their hands, and shot out a web of chakra threads, the shimmering blue almost glinting under the midday sun. Azumo frowned in concentration, mentally ticking off the list of places Haruki had given him as he directed his threads to different parts of the village. Well, this wasn't too bad. So long as the genin didn't take too long, he could probably keep this up for a few hours. Although, he twitched a finger to extend one last thread, reducing the chakra output by about a tenth, towards Shushuya. He figured it took Suna-nin quite a while to become puppet masters. Katetsu inwardly made a face as he controlled the chakra regulation in his threads. This was harder than he thought it would be. But, he thought as he tagged the side wall of Ichiraku Ramen with a thread, it was also just as much fun as he had thought it would be. Guiding the threads through the twists and turns of the village any way he wanted was good practice, and it would be interesting to see what these genin could do when he adjusted the chakra level of some of the threads. Alright. Kiba turned to Hinata. Hinata, just find the right threads and leave the rest to Akamaru. He paused, glancing hesitantly at his other teammate before adding grudgingly, and Shino's bugs can help too. Hinata nodded and activated her Byakugan, and then almost reeled when she saw the village open before her. Haruki-san took down the barriers. She stared in surprise. Kiba glanced between her and the village. Really? So you can see through stuff again? Hinata nodded happily before her face fell a little. But can't see that far. Kiba shrugged nonchalantly. Hey, who cares? You can work on that from now on and it'll get better, right? Hinata smiled tentatively at that as she nodded. Turning her Byakugan to the chakra threads, she frowned closely at the strings, quickly ruling out 9 of them. She glanced nervously at the 2 chunin and quietly pointed them out. The shinobi exchanged an amused look before releasing them, leaving 11 behind. This time, Hinata had to peer more closely at the threads, ruling out 2 more before becoming stumped. The last 9 looked identical. She glanced uncertainly back at her teammates and Kiba promptly bounded forward. Alright. Let's each take a path and follow it. Whoever finds them first can use a bunshin to send for the others, okay? Hinata nodded and Shino inclined his head before all 3 set off. The threads faded in color as they drew farther away from the 2 chunin, but Akamaru had already jumped to the ground to lead Kiba. Shino had his bugs spread out in front of him, and Hinata quickly followed the trail with her eyes. Behind them, Katetsu and Azumo smirked. Haruki had said they could do anything they wanted to the incorrect strings and none of them had picked the right one. Without a word, they adjusted the threads so that they ran through alleyways and down streets, looping around the buildings to lead the genin in useless circles. Wonder how long it'll take for them to catch on. Katetsu settled on the ground, transferring his remaining 4 strings to his right hand and withdrawing a kunai with his left to draw idle doodles on the ground. Azumo rolled his eyes but sat down as well. They made a rather strange sight. He was glad Anko wasn't around to laugh at them as they sat in front of the entrance gates with chakra threads attached to their hands. Then again, she could just as easily want to join in. It was always hard to tell her. XX. 3 hours later, they were both twitching. God, how long are they going to take? Katetsu flopped back on the ground, ignoring the fact that it shook the 2 remaining chakra threads attached to his fingers. Damn, he was starving. Azumo tried not to scowl and reminded himself that they were only genin. Seeing as he had been telling himself that for the past 2 hours, it wasn't working very well. He transferred the 3 threads from one hand to the other. By some sort of bad luck, all 3 genin had managed to pick every thread except the 2 that they needed. He and Katetsu had played with them for a while, adjusting the threads so that they led the students in circles. But seriously, how much longer were they going to take? Hungry. An amused voice sounded from beside them and they turned to see Haruki and Kurenai approaching, weighed down with boxes of food. Our saviors. Katetsu cheered, shooting up again as he accepted a box from Haruki. Ooh. Yakisoba. Thanks. Azumo grinned a thanks up at the 2 junin as well before digging in. You really should have come earlier, he commented reproachfully. I had to listen to Tetsu moan about his stomach. Katetsu shot him a scowl as he swallowed a big mouthful. Hey, you were just as hungry as I was. Don't put this all on me. Haruki exchanged an amused smile with Kurenai. These 2 were always good for a few laughs. Hey, are your students doing anyway? Azumo inquired. Kurenai shrugged gracefully. They're following the trails well enough. Shino's been the quickest to figure out that his strings are just misleads. Kiba's the slowest. Hey, we played with them for a bit, Kotetsu remarked with a grin. We can't extend chakra strings through the entire village, so we just keep looping back. Needless to say, it's been working. They all glanced up as they sensed Kiba's chakra signature storming towards them and Shino and Hinata not far behind. Ah. Haruki straightened. We better get going. Thanks for the help, you two. The two Chunin waved their chopsticks in the air. No problem. It was pretty fun. Come back anytime. And remember to buy lunch for us again. Haruki chuckled and waved a hand behind him before sunshining away, Kurenai a few steps behind him. XX. We found you. Haruki and Kurenai turned from their spots on the Hokage monument, legs dangling over the edge. They both held back smiles as Kiba stormed up to them, expression thunderous and looking dusty and exhausted. Akamaru was resting on top of Kiba's head, obviously dozing, and Shino and Hinata didn't look to be faring much better. The Aburame heir was as stoic as ever, but there was a tired air around him as he came up to them. The Hyuga heiress was panting, her Byakugan deactivated as she half stumbled towards them as well. Haruki smiled and stood up. Congratulations. We just talked with Kotetsu and Azumo a few minutes before you followed the last string. You've gotten faster. Kiba scowled and glared suspiciously at the ribbons, sniffing at them. Alright, they're the right ones. Now I can rest. He flopped to the ground, reclining back on his hands. Kurenai chuckled and rose to her feet as well, smiling at her students. Hinata had somehow managed to pull them together, though she suspected that there was still something unresolved between Kiba and Shino. Good job, she said instead. I didn't expect you to get here so quickly after returning to Kotetsu and Azumo again. Despite his fatigue, Kiba grinned up at her. Akamaru's the best. He can find anyone quickly once he gets a lead. A near-invisible frown marred Shino's brow as his irritation from the long mission and Kiba's usual antics came to a breaking point, and he remarked sharply, my Kikaichu helped as well. If it were not for them, your dog would not have been as fast. Kiba was immediately on his feet, almost dislodging Akamaru. Hey, don't insult Akamaru. His temper flared as Kurenai tried to calm him down. He's an Inuzuka dog. We're the best trackers in the world. Shino's voice was tight with tension as he retorted flatly, Kikaichu are less noticeable. They are obviously better trackers. Akamaru got confused when two chakra threads crossed each other. If you were older, perhaps you two would have been able to tell the diff. Kiba cut in, eyes glaring as he snarled, we're getting better every day. And Akamaru's the best partner anyone could have, and I'm not weak, so just shut up. And then, without a backwards glance, the Inuzuka rushed off, shoving roughly past both of them as he descended the Hokage monument again. Kurenai stared at her team, wondering how things had gone downhill so quickly. Why would Kiba snap like that? Granted, he was more tired than usual, but Shino's first remark hadn't been very out of character. It was along the same things the bug user always said. Hinata stared between Shino and Kiba, unsure of how to proceed. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts and she turned to look at Haruki. Could you go after him, Hinata-chan? Haruki hadn't moved from his spot and he waited for Hinata to nod and, throwing one last worried glance at the motionless Aburame, hurry after Kiba. He glanced at Kurenai and tilted his head at Shino. The kunoichi seemed to understand because she nodded after a moment and, reaching out to pat Shino's shoulder as she passed, took off after her other two students. Haruki waited until the others were out of sight before letting his gaze slide over to Shino. For once, the bug user looked almost unsettled, shifting subtly on the spot as his Kikaichu, sensing his anxiety, stirred beneath his coat. Shino-kun, Haruki finally called out softly as he dropped back down to sit at the edge. Indulge me and come sit with me for a bit, please. A long moment of silence resounded around them, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind. And then there was a shuffle of footsteps and the Aburame heir carefully sat down on the ledge as well, leaving a good 2 feet between them. Haruki remained quiet, staring out over the village as he waited for Shino to speak. From long experience, he knew that the bug user would only talk when he was good and ready and no amount of prodding would get him to do otherwise. The fact that Shino had chosen to sit next to him instead of simply walking away meant that he was actually willing to talk. I did not mean it that way, Shino finally said, hands stuffed deep in his coat as sat stiffly beside the red-haired Junin. He wasn't quite sure why he was even sitting there really, but his feet had brought him over to Haruki, so there he was. Kiba as always. He trailed off, not knowing how to describe his teammate without insulting him too badly. Touchy. The Junin beside him offered, a tinge of hollow amusement in his voice. You could say that he has reason to be. Shino glanced over at Haruki out of the corner of his eye. What did that mean? But the Junin didn't expand any further, instead continuing with a completely different line of conversation. What did you think of the exercise today? Shino frowned, absently tapping a heel against the Yondaime's hair. An amused snicker made him glance to the side again, only to find Haruki staring at his foot with a private smile glinting in his eyes. Abruptly, he stilled his foot even as Haruki turned his gaze back to the village again. It was different, Shino revealed. Kurenai-sensei has never done something like that with us. Why, you ask? Because Abarames and Inazukas and even Hyugas are natural trackers. Our skills are honed with age. He paused for a moment, considering the difficulty he had had. It was easier with Hinata and Kiba, he admitted at last. It would have taken much longer if I had had to do it alone. Haruki smiled. That's what teammates are for. So you don't have to carry your burdens alone. It takes a while for teams to click. Some teams fall together immediately, like Shikamaru-kun, Ino-chan, and Choji-kun. Other teams have a lot of infighting, but they pull together when it really counts, like Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura. Then there are teams like yours, the redhead glanced down at Shino, who don't really mesh until you get the opportunity to understand each other. Shino's frown deepened, but he remained silent. He still wasn't sure he understood. Was it hard? Haruki asked, going off on another tangent again. Sending out your bugs to retrieve information and all. Shino glanced suspiciously at the Junin before inclining his head cautiously. It was time-consuming, especially in places where my bugs have not been yet. He hesitated before continuing. I have been working on a new jutsu, but it is not going well. Oh. Haruki looked over. Maybe I could help. What's the jutsu? Shino silently pressed a hand against the ground, muttering, Haijutsu, Mushios. A faint web of chakra extended from his hand, but it stuttered to a stop about a meter away. Lips pressed together in frustration, Shino withdrew his chakra and turned back to the village. Haruki heeded thoughtfully before extending his own hand. Well, why don't you try making chakra threads, like Katetsu and Azumo today? Shino blinked as blue threads shot from the Junin's fingers and attached itself to a nearby rock. With a subtle twitch, the string yanked the rock off the ground and Haruki caught it neatly as it flew through the air. How did you? He leaned forward before catching himself. But Haruki only grinned, dropping the rock and reaching for his own hand. Shino hesitated. He usually didn't like anyone touching him. His Kikaichu sometimes didn't move fast enough and would get crushed in the few times someone did. But to his surprise, Haruki made sure to circle his fingers only around his hand and not above his wrist, gently extending his fingers. First of all, concentrate a controlled point of chakra to your fingers. Try your index to begin. And then just imagine pushing your chakra out in a controlled way, only through that finger. Try it. Shino silently did as he was told, eyes narrowing in concentration as he released the chakra. To his alarm, a burst of chakra poured out of his hand, jerking him backwards and shaking a few Kikaichu loose from where they were resting under his coat. The Kikaichu instinctively flew towards the small explosion of chakra and Shino instinctively opened his mouth to cry out a warning. Two hands suddenly shot out and caught the three Kikaichu in cupped hands, drawing them away from the fading burst of energy and returning them to his coat. Wide-eyed, Shino stared at the very much alive bugs fluttering lazily on his sleeve. Shino-kun. Shino jerked up to stare at the Junin. Are they all right? Sorry. I guess I should have warned you that that might happen. Haruki reached up to tuck a stray lock of hair behind one ear and Shino caught the reddened skin on the back of one hand. You are hurt, he stated, somewhat stupidly, he thought. Of course the Junin knew he was hurt. Chakra burns stung. Haruki glanced down at his hand. He had barely noticed. Don't worry, he reassured the genin. I've had much worse. This will go away soon enough. Are your bugs all right? Shino nodded, letting the Kikaichu crawl back under his coat. You did not have to save them, he said after a moment, not really sure where he was going with this, only knowing that the brief flare of panic in his stomach had faded when Haruki had saved his bugs. They would have died in a few hours. Haruki only smiled warmly down at him. Yes, but they're important to you, aren't they? No matter how unimportant something may seem to others, if it's important to you, then you have to protect it at all costs. You're my student, at least for today, so is your sensei. What's important to you is important to me. Besides, I know how important Kikaichu are. Konoha's lucky to have them. Shino stared some more, finding himself completely out of his depth. He wanted to say, thank you, or do something to show his gratitude for the Junin for doing something so seemingly insignificant, but he couldn't quite get the words out and, in the end, simply extended a hand again. Show me again, please. Shino found himself unsurprised when Haruki simply nodded and took his hand again. They worked on producing chakra threads for several more minutes until Shino could extend a weak thread of chakra outwards. It wouldn't attach to anything, but Haruki assured him that simply creating them was the first step. Now, the Junin continued briskly. Try doing your jutsu again. Shino nodded and placed his hand on the ground again. To his surprise, the web seemed to spread from his hand more easily, extending a good 2.5 meters before stopping again. He glanced up questioningly at Haruki. A web is easier to create than singular threads, the redhead explained. Chakra threads are more concentrated, so if you can do that, a web should come much easier. Shino nodded again and this time managed a quiet, thank you. Haruki smiled before reaching into a pocket and withdrawing a green ribbon. Your prize for successfully completing the mission today, he announced cheerfully, extending the thin strip of cloth towards him. Shino blinked as he accepted it, not quite sure what he was supposed to do with it. His hand stilled as he caught sight of the design, small and meticulously depicted, on the surface of one end of the ribbon. It was a Kikaichu. The detail was amazing. Looking closely, Shino could pick out the faint lines on his clan's bug's wings, sewn on the forest green cloth in silver thread. Only the eyes were a different shade, an emerald green that almost seemed to shine under the afternoon sunlight. Abarames were quiet because they wanted to be, not because they couldn't find words to express themselves, but for once, Shino found himself at a loss for words. When I was young, Haruki said beside him, voice measured. I lived alone. I had to learn to do a lot of things most of the other kids didn't, and sewing was one of them. Had to fix my own clothes, you see, so I'm pretty good at that. An almost self-conscious pause. Do you like it? Right away. Shino nodded, clutching the ribbon tightly in one hand. Again, he managed a soft, thank you, before carefully tucking the ribbon away in his pocket. He would carry it with him from now on, perhaps for good luck. Listen to those around you, Shino-kun, Haruki's voice made him look up again. Not just to what they say but also to what they don't say. And look at those around you too, not just at what they show you, but what you can see when you really look at them. Shino considered the words, still not quite understanding. He glanced up at the redhead and tilted his head in question. Haruki nodded decisively back at him before clambering to his feet, tugging at his coat. All right, come on. Kiba's probably gotten into trouble by now. He always likes to pick fights when he's angry. I think you'll see something interesting if we hurry. Mystified, Shino rose to his feet as well, trotting after the Junin without a second thought. XX. 5 minutes later, Shino stood in the shadows of an alleyway, staring with a strange mix of consternation and anger at the altercation playing out before him. Runt of the litter is a bit far from home, isn't he? One Chunin jeered. Kiba glared furiously back at them, fists clenched as Akamaru growled on top of his head. Behind him, Hinata stood frozen to the spot, looking shocked and uncertain, but a rising flush of anger colored her cheeks. Shut the hell up. I'm going to be clan head one day. I'll be the strongest shinobi in Konoha. The trio of Chunin scoffed. That's what you always say, but how are you gonna do that if you never get stronger? Besides, everyone knows Hana's going to be the next Inuzuka head. At least she's strong. All you ever do is fail at school and skip out on training to play with that pathetic excuse of a dog. Little boys shouldn't play at being shinobi. Don't insult Akamaru. Kiba yelled, and Shino inwardly winced at the familiar words. He's gonna become the greatest Inuzuka dog in the clan. The Chunin near the front laughed, loud and mocking. Yeah, what's he gonna do? Woof someone to death. The teen took a step forward and Akamaru immediately leapt to the ground, young voice yipping madly as his hackles raised. This only made the Chunin laugh harder even as one aimed a kick at the dog. Kiba lunged forward and managed to drag his partner back just in time. Do you understand now, Shino-kun? Haruki's voice sounded above Shino and he nodded woodenly, a funny ringing in his ears when the Chunin made for his teammate again. Well, a gentle push to his shoulder propelled him forward. He's your teammate, isn't he? Perhaps even a rival and maybe a friend one day. What are you waiting for? That was all the prompting Shino needed, and a silent command to his Kikaichu had them shooting towards the jeering teens with single-minded intensity. Kiba pulled back, still clinging onto a growling Akamaru when a cloud of bugs swarmed the Chunin in front of him, dissolving their laughter to shrieks of alarm. Seconds later, they were scrambling away, chased down the streets by the Aburame clan's signature partners. Slowly, Kiba rose to his feet, blinking bewilderedly as his other teammates stepped from the shadows of an alleyway. They stared at each other for a long moment, but surprisingly, it was Shino who spoke first. I apologize, the Aburame heir said clearly. I did not mean what I said on the Hokage monument. I was only tired and took it out on you. Kiba stared wide-eyed at the bug user, opening his mouth to say something back only to find himself gaping. That's all right, he finally spluttered, surprised to find that he meant it. I'm sorry too. I said some pretty bad things as well. Not just today. A stilted silence fell between them and Kiba concentrated on patting Akamaru. This was really weird. Usually, he and Shino just didn't get along, but, well, this side of Shino he could live with. And he had defended him. Thanks, he said awkwardly, gesturing in the direction that the Chunin had ran off in. I appreciate it. Shino nodded once and the silence this time wasn't as bad. They both glanced at Hinata when a soft giggle was heard. Sorry, she stammered out, hands clasped together. But why you two can actually get along pretty well when you both try. Kiba turned back to Shino, a little bemused at the change in team dynamics. They were completely different this morning. A throat clearing drew their attention to their sensei and they all straightened when Kurenai approached them, a broad smile that spoke of pride directed at them. She didn't say anything though, as if any words mentioned about their tentative camaraderie might ruin it. Behind her, Haruki followed at a more sedate pace, hands comfortably stuck in his coat. Feeling suddenly embarrassed, Kiba glanced down again, crouching to pick up Akamaru. Sheesh, he grumbled half-heartedly. You're always jumping out at people way bigger than you. Why are you always doing that? Can't you use your head first before you go rushing in? Soft laughter snapped his gaze back up and he frowned at the red-haired Junin as the man approached. Haruki quirked an eyebrow at him, mouth curved in a gentle smile. You should know, Kiba. Dogs aren't like humans, no matter how intelligent they are. They don't need a reason to protect their important people. He glanced down at the white puppy. Right, Akamaru. Akamaru yipped in agreement, tail wagging. Kiba stared in shock at Haruki before blinking down at his partner. Not many people talked directly to his dog, as if Akamaru couldn't understand. A rustle drew his attention back to the Junin and his jaw dropped when Haruki pulled out a bag of Inuzuka dog treats. Where did you? Haruki grinned a little as he withdrew a treat. Akamaru's ears suddenly perked up. Your sister sold it to me earlier this morning. May I? Oh, yeah, sure. Akamaru was already wagging like crazy and he snapped up the two treats that were offered at once, yipping a, thank you, and a, they're delicious afterwards before jumping towards Haruki, settling into the arms that automatically came out to catch him. Kiba watched, astonished when Haruki chuckled and replied, you're welcome. And I wouldn't know but I'm glad you like them. You can understand him. Haruki shrugged, shaking his head as he put away the treats before passing Akamaru back. No, But I can guess. I've spent time around a few dogs over the years. Without waiting for a reply, he withdrew a blue and a yellow ribbon next, offering the yellow one to Kiba and the blue one to Hinata. Kiba examined it curiously as Akamaru clambered back up onto his head to get a better view. Hey, that's Akamaru. And it was. The depiction of his partner and best friend was sewn in white and brown thread against the sunshine golden yellow of the ribbon, and even as small as it was, the figure was clearly standing guard over something, jaws opened as if barking and tail flaring behind him. Thanks, Haruki-san. Kiba openly beamed up at Haruki, grinning happily as he showed it to Akamaru. Haruki only gazed back almost solemnly. You did well today. Regardless of what other people say, if you think you can do it, then show everyone else what you and Akamaru can do. Become the best Inuzuka combo to ever come out of Konoha. Kiba stilled, hand clenched around the ribbon. Haruki hadn't told him to train harder, like his mother, or study more, like his sister, simply do. Show me you can do it. Show the world you can do it. He looked back up, gaze firmer this time and nodded sharply, once. Being one of the strongest shinobi with Akamaru beside him had always been what he wanted. If he tried hard enough, if he didn't give up. He glanced up at his partner. They could do it, and they'd show those who called them runts just who were better. Hinata-chan, something wrong. Haruki turned to the Hyuga heiress who was looking mildly confused as she stared down at her ribbon. Why a tiger? Hinata asked timidly. She had always liked the magnificent cats but surely one wouldn't fit her. Haruki smiled, a tinge of wistfulness entering his expression. One day, Hinata would sign a summoning contract with tigers, and he couldn't say any other animal suited the Hyuga heiress more than the majestic animals. Tigers symbolize courage, Hinata-chan. Haruki chuckled at the blush that rose in the girl's face. They also represent improvement and change, triumphs in the impossible, and above all else, freedom. Don't let anyone or anything hold you back, Hinata-chan, and that includes yourself. You'll become far greater than you could ever imagine. All you have to do is let yourself do that. Hinata was wide-eyed and blushing when Haruki stopped, but she didn't hesitate to nod this time, and she carefully wrapped the indigo ribbon with the flame orange and black tiger design around her wrist, carefully tucking the ends away. She would carry it with her, as a reminder of what Haruki had taught her today. All right then. Haruki took a step back and glanced briefly at a bemused-looking Kurenai. I've gone on long enough. Thanks for going along with my tedious mission. All three of you have done really well today. I was impressed with the way you clicked together once you actually started trying to work as a team. But I'm sure you've had enough of me for one day, so I guess I'll just let Kurenai take over now. Kurenai quirked an eyebrow at him but stepped up with a warm smile. Great job today, everyone. Your teamwork's improved quite a bit, and I've spotted some areas in your tracking skills that could use some work, so we'll start on that tomorrow. Training is at the same time in the morning, so get a good night's rest, okay? All three genin nodded obediently, and it wasn't long before Kurenai and Hinata departed first. Kurenai brushed by Haruki, thanking him warmly for the training session, though her eyes thanked him for a much deeper reason. He had pulled her team together for her, something she wasn't sure she would have managed for at least a few months more. Of course, the dynamics still needed work, and Kiba and Shino would no doubt get into another fight sooner or later, but something between the boys had disappeared, and Hinata now looked at her and not at the ground. Hinata left next, needing to be home before her sparring session with Hanabi started. She would try harder this time. Her sister couldn't look up to her if she was always looking down. She thanked Haruki shyly, and the Junin smiled back at her, friendly and warm and entirely focused on her. She left the practice with an almost skip in her step. Haruki stared with some puzzlement at the last two of Team 8, not quite sure what they wanted. They glanced at each other and then seemed to come to some sort of silent agreement. Haruki-san, would you be free for a couple minutes tomorrow, sometime around 6? Kiba asked eagerly. It's just that our parents, my mum and Shino's dad, are coming home and I want my mum to meet you. No one's ever actually took the time to listen to Akamaru before, and she'd be interested to see you. She can be a bit scary though, and she's impatient and gets angry easily and really tough. Haruki's sweat dropped. Yeah, that sounded a lot like the Sum he knew. Should I be worried? Kiba rubbed the back of head. Nah. Ka-chan's great once you get to know her and she can be all those things but I love her anyway, ya know. He ducked his head, hiding the embarrassed red as it rose in his face. Haruki chuckled but nodded. I get it. He turned to Shino. And you'd like me to meet your dad too? Shino inclined his head. You treat Kikaichu very differently than most people outside of the Aburame clan. I would like to introduce my father to you. Haruki sighed, running a hand through his hair. Well, he would have to meet the last two clan heads sooner or later, so it might as well be now. Alright, but on one condition. Both boys blinked at him. Go get a bowl of ramen together. Both genin looked taken aback, glancing at each other before looking back at him. Haruki held back a smile and nodded firmly. Go on. I'll meet you at the park near the academy tomorrow at 6 if you go get dinner together. Consider it boys only team bonding training. Hurry up. The two boys blinked at him again before Kiba shrugged and grinned a little, less cautious and friendlier. Shino remained stoic but he nodded once and made no move to protest. Haruki grinned inwardly. It was a start. He waved the two boys off and didn't start moving away until they disappeared around a corner, Kiba already talking a mile a minute about something or other. Satisfied, Haruki turned and headed back to his own apartment. Overall, he supposed he did an okay job with Team 8. He had given them a push in the right direction and he hoped it was enough to cement the team together. XX. Resting beside the hospital bed in the uncomfortable plastic chair, Yugo listened to the steady beep 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 of the heart monitor and offered up thanks once again for the umpteenth time that day. Her boyfriend was going to live. Hayate would live a long and healthy life, missions notwithstanding. And she couldn't even thank the right person for it because she didn't know who it was. I'm sorry, but he doesn't wish to have his name revealed, Takumi shrugged apologetically at them. Yugo clutched at Hayate's hand as the man slept on, for once undisturbed by rasping coughs. But I have to thank him, she said earnestly. I didn't think this could ever happen. I have to at least thank him. Takumi merely shook his head. He doesn't want you to know, and I gave him my word that I wouldn't say. Yugo's face fell. But why would he do this and not want anything in return? Here, the doctor smiled, genuine and thoughtful. He is something of a rarity these days. I asked him what he wanted in return for the cure and he got angry with me. He chuckled. Refused payment right then and there. Yugo couldn't help the bewilderment that surfaced on her face. But why would he help Hayate specifically? Takumi smiled again. Yugo-chan, there are people out there who help just because they can. He seems to be one of them. He turned to leave, tossing one last comment over his shoulder. You two have a very good friend. Perhaps one day, if you ever find out, you might be inclined to help him in return. He certainly looks like he needs it. Yugo leaned forward and rested her head on the edge of the bed, cheek against the white sheets. What did the medic mean by that? Was their mysterious benefactor in some sort of trouble? And did Takumi really mean that he was a friend? But why would any of their friends keep something like this from them? Yugo. The sleep-roughed voice stirred her from her position and she quickly jerked up, leaning over her lover anxiously. It was the first time Hayate had woken up since going through the surgery. Hayate, you're awake. How do you feel? Hayate smiled sleepily up at her. Fine. Great. I don't think I've ever been able to breathe so well. Yugo almost burst into tears as a wave of relief crashed into her. Takumi had assured her that the surgery had been a success, but it was far better to hear it straight from Hayate. I'm so glad, she whispered, clasping one of her boyfriend's hands again. Takumi-san said that you'll need to rest for a couple more days, just to get any lingering side effects of the treatment out of your system, but you're going to be back to full strength really soon. Hayate quirked another crooked smile at her, the one that always made her feel like the luckiest woman alive, and yes, she definitely was, because how many other women with terminally ill boyfriends were suddenly given another chance right out of the blue? So did you have any luck finding out who saved my life? Yugo shook her head, absently lacing her fingers with Hayate's. No, Takumi-san wouldn't tell me. But I think he did say it was a friend though. Hayate's brow furrowed. All our friends act like they're walking on ice when they talk about my sickness. They'd never be able to keep something like this a secret. Yugo nodded in agreement. Well, whoever it is doesn't want to be known. Hayate arched an eyebrow at her. I don't suppose that's going to stop you. Yugo grinned back. Of course not. I'll do some digging. Surely someone must know something. Hayate chuckled, shifting a little. I'll leave you to it then. In the meantime, when should we tell the others? Yugo brightened, eyes dancing. Do you really think I was going to keep it from them any longer than necessary? I sent Sai off with messages a while ago. She's to deliver them the moment you woke up. Her cat summon had the odd ability to communicate telepathically with her from certain distances. Quite useful in tight situations. Hayate gave her a puzzled look. You told them I've been cured with pieces of paper. Yugo scowled good-naturedly at him. Of course not. I just told them that you're in the hospital and to come right away. Hayate started, eyes widening as he pushed himself up. What? Wait. Then there. Hayate. The door burst open and Kotetsu and Azumo piled in, looking frantic and prepared for the worst. Another flurry of footsteps sounded behind them and Anko, Raida, and Genma pushed their way in as well. Anko's expression was darker than a storm cloud, brow furrowed as she tried to cover up the anxiety flashing in her eyes. Beside her, Raida's lips were pressed tightly together and he began scanning Hayate as if by simply looking hard enough, he would be able to tell what was wrong. And bringing up the rear was Genma, who looked as calm and collected as ever, Senbon stuck in his mouth, but his face was almost completely white and the brown eyes that surveyed him were narrowed with tightly reined apprehension. Hayate, what's wrong? Why are you in here? A relapse. The fuck is the doctor? Shouldn't he be here doing his fucking job? How do you feel? Nausea, fever, pain. Are you even dying? Genma's pointed question overrode everyone else's babbling and they all turned to stare at him. The Senbon wielder's face seemed less pale now as he studied the Kenjutsu expert sitting up in the hospital bed. He had come in expecting the worst news possible, that his longtime friend had finally used up his 9 lives fighting the disease and they were supposed to come and say their last goodbyes. He had almost thrown up when he had gotten Yugo's message. But when he had walked in, inwardly terrified to the core, his friend's rapid-fire questions had given him enough time to take in the situation and he had noticed the light in Yugo's eyes and the relaxed slant of Hayate's shoulders, no longer tensed to stave off continuous bouts of coughing. On the bed, Hayate sighed and shot his girlfriend an exasperated look. Yugo grinned sheepishly. Whoops. Whoops. Anko snapped, taking another step forward. What? Whoops. What the hell's going on? Both Yugo and Hayate smiled at this, bright and happy. Hayate spread his arms, smile morphing into a small grin. All cured. Stunned silence descended on the room and Yugo hurried on with an explanation. Early this morning, someone approached Takumi-san and gave him the cure for Hayate's sickness. Takumi-san called us in, explained the treatment, did the surgery to remove the disease, and here we are. She leaned in, pressing closer to Hayate. He's all cured. Totally and completely cured. Nobody moved for several long seconds and the ticking of the clock on one white wall echoed loudly around them. And then Kotetsu and Azumo were surging forward, all but tackling Hayate as Yugo hastily backed away, laughing and almost crying at the same time. Anko whooped happily, bounding forward as well as she promised to buy Hayate a number of sweets that he had previously been unable to eat. Raida and Genma remained a few feet away but Raida was grinning broadly and Genma was smiling around his Senbon, shoulders slumped in relief. 10 minutes later, when they had all calmed down enough that the nurses had finally stopped threatening to kick them out, Raida inevitably asked, so who exactly approached Kano-sensei? Or are you not supposed to say? Yugo shook her head. We don't know either. Takumi-san promised him that he wouldn't say anything. She glanced at them. Though I guess your reactions rule out you lot. Azumo frowned a little. Rule us out. Why would we have anything to do with it? Hayate shrugged, now reclining against the raised bed. Apparently, whoever he is, he's supposed to be a friend. Dude. Kotetsu quirked a smile at him. I think anyone who saves your life can be considered a friend. But the way Takumi-san said it made it sound as if he knew us. Yugo spoke up again. And he said that whoever he is seems like he needs help too. Hayate glanced sharply at her, having not heard that part yet. Needs help. Is he hurt? In trouble? Yugo shook her head again. Takumi-san said he certainly looks like he needs it. Could be both. Well, if he needs help, Anko announced. We'll just find I am and do that. We can all do some poking around. There was a general round of agreement from all of them before Kotetsu and Azumo turned the conversation to something lighter, filling them in on the fun they had had earlier that day during the training exercise that Haruki had invited them to take part in. Anko chimed in enviously, grouchy that she hadn't been invited as well until Raida reminded her that she had been away on border patrol with him and Genma. None of them noticed the thoughtful frown that passed over Genma's face as the red-haired Junin was brought up. It was a few hours later before the nurses finally had enough of them and shooed them out. They all departed for the day, promising that they would return early the next morning. Hayate just waved them out cheerfully, falling back on the bed to get the first peaceful night of sleep since he could remember. As Genma made his way home, waving a lazy goodnight to his friends when they parted, his mind turned back to the sneaking suspicion that had crept up on him the moment Yugo and Hayate had revealed what little information they had on their benefactor. A friend. Someone who knew them, or more accurately, someone who knew of Hayate's sickness and had most likely found out only recently. And someone who looked like they needed help. There was only one person Genma could think of that fit all four descriptions. But why? Why would Haruki not want them to find out? Surely the Junin wouldn't mind some appreciation from them all. But did it really matter? Haruki had helped Hayate without asking for anything in return, had acted like a real friend would even though they had only just met the day before. And judging from Kotetsu and Azumo's recount of their day, the red-haired Junin seemed to honestly want to help the people around him, from 12-year-old genin to terminally ill adults. As far as Genma was concerned, that was enough to convince him of the redhead's sincerity. Takumi had said that Haruki seemed to need help, and after the fainting episode yesterday and the fatigue that Genma had noticed was always weighing the man down, the Senbon wielder fully agreed with the assessment. If Haruki didn't want anyone to know what he had done for whatever reason, then Genma would respect that. The others would find out eventually anyway. But that didn't mean he couldn't keep an eye on the redhead in the meantime, just to make sure he didn't do anything recklessly stupid or keeled over again because he was too stubborn to go to the hospital. After all, it was the least Genma could do for the man who had saved one of his closest friends from a premature death. As Sume rushed towards her village's gates with Kuromaru loping at her side and Shibi on her tail, she expected to head straight to the Hokage Tower, check in with the Sandame, be briefed on whatever the hell was happening with the Hyugas at the moment, and then go home and crash for the next 10 hours. That didn't happen. Ka-chan. Welcome home. Sume skidded to a stop in front of the main gates, feeling mildly bemused as her son bounded up to her, Akamaru on his head and an excited grin on his face, and wasn't that Shibi's kid behind him? Ah, I'm back, Sume managed to return. What's with the personal reception, brat? Come on. Shino and I wanna introduce you to someone. Her son glanced at her mission partner as he stepped up beside her. And Shino's dad too, of course. Come on. Sume shared a look with Shibi, not bothering to hide her bewilderment. Shino and I. Last time she checked, their sons didn't get along at all. What the hell was going on? What the hell is going on? She demanded, crossing her arms and ignoring the warning elbow she got from Shibi to curb her language. What are you planning, Kiba? Her son took on a mildly hurt countenance and glanced at Shibi's son for support. And Shino stepped up to give it. Had the world flipped itself when she wasn't looking? Kiba is not planning anything. Sume-sama, Shino started in that stilted way all Aburame talked in. We simply wish to introduce both of you to someone we know. Drop the Sama, kid. Seriously, Sume told him absently as she stared between the two of them, standing companionably next to each other. She traded another glance with Shibi. Her former teammate and longtime field partner looked as emotionless as ever to most people, but Sume could pick out the confusion in the slight frown creasing the man's brow. Oh good. So it wasn't just her then. Who is this person then? Sume finally asked, letting her son tug her along as they entered Konoha while Shibi followed at a more sedate pace. She flicked a glance at Kuromaru and the dog nodded and loped off towards home. Her partner deserved some rest after such a long mission. A Junin, Shino spoke first, and since when did an Aburame speak first, especially in the presence of an Inuzuka? He was our temporary sensei yesterday. Why you ask? Because Kurenai sensei invited him to join us. He helped with our tracking skills. The Aburame heir trailed off and glanced at Kiba with an almost thoughtful air. And our teamwork. I see. Sum really didn't see because she had always thought that it would take months and a miracle for their sons to see eye to eye. She and Shibi hadn't gotten along at first either, and it had only been after their third mission when she had been saved by her reticent teammate that she had started to see him as something more than an annoyance, and she had thought that Kiba would be the same. Walking beside her, Shibi observed his son from behind. Shino was still keeping several inches between himself and his boisterous partner, but he didn't shy away or step to the side when Sum's son brushed against him. What had happened? His son usually came home from the academy in a typically silent but foul mood whenever he had a brush in with Kiba. Granted, he hadn't seen Shino in almost 2 months, missing his graduation because of the damn mission, but surely being put on the same team wouldn't suddenly make them friends. As if sensing his gaze, Shino turned to look over his shoulder and glanced up at him. Otu-san. Shibi blinked behind his sunglasses. Which Junin is it, Shino? His son cocked his head. Kazama Haruki. Recently returned from an extended mission. A short pause. He is respectful of our bugs, Otu-san. Shibi's eyebrows shot up a fraction even as Kiba jumped in enthusiastically, and it's like he understands Akamaru. I mean, he says he doesn't really, but he can guess what Akamaru's saying. Right, boy. Akamaru yipped happily, wagging his tail. Kiba laughed. That's right. Haruki-san spoils you with treats too. Ka-chan, Haruki-san knows how to treat our dogs properly. Before he came to train us, he bought a bag of the food that only Inuzuka dogs eat. Shibi glanced at his former teammate, noting the consternation on her face. He knew the food Inuzukas fed their dogs were only sold in one specific store and was completely run by the Inuzuka clan. One would have to do some very fast talking and have a very good reason to buy anything from them. Who was manning the store? Sum demanded. Kiba looked confused at the annoyed tone that his mother had taken on. Nei-chan was. Sum blinked, stunned. Her own daughter, who was almost as protective of her clan's dogs and secrets as she was, had sold their specially developed food to some Junin Sum had never heard of. Who was this guy? We told him to wait for us at the park near the academy, Kiba continued, walking even faster now. Hurry up. 5 minutes later, they walked into the park and Kiba pointed excitedly, there he is. That's him, Ka-chan. Sum squinted at the red-haired shinobi. He had his back turned so she couldn't see his face, but she was sure she had never laid eyes on any ninja with hair that color for a long time. Do you know him, Shibi? She muttered quietly, glancing beside her. Shibi shook his head minutely, eyes glued to the shinobi across the playground. Moments later, he felt his kikaichu stir. He frowned. They recognized the Junin to some degree. He silently asked for a clarification, but his bugs didn't seem all that inclined to answer him. Shibi only managed to pick up detached whispers that didn't particularly make much sense. Familiar. Descendant. Know him. Strong. Very strong. Stronger than the one before. Sad, so very sad. Sacrifice. Alone. Always alone. Lost forever. Danger. Help him. Shibi quickly cut the connection, mind racing. Though Kikaichu only lived for several hours, they had the ability to pass on knowledge to each generation after them, retaining a long memory of people they had come into contact with even decades after. Remarkably, they were also able to sense a shinobi's chakra as well as anything they had come into contact with, and pick up on their emotional state to an extent. A useful skill when judging an enemy shinobi's condition in a fight. But Shibi had never met anyone who could cause such a strong reaction from his bugs. Obviously, this Kazama Haruki reminded them of someone that their earlier generations had met before. But Shibi didn't know any ninja with this Junin's surname. And his Kikaichu, who usually simply reported back to him as they were trained to do, were openly insisting on giving assistance, as if they sensed something of great enough importance that helping this shinobi was for the best. Kikaichu didn't live long. As helpful as they were to the Aburame clan, they didn't particularly care whether or not their hosts died and vice versa. They simply moved on once their chakra supply was cut off. Death was literally part of life for them and they didn't have complicated feelings about it like humans did. But did this mean that something was going to happen, something big enough that even the Kikaichu were worried? Shibi, what's wrong with you? Sume hissed beside him, gaze sharp. Shibi shrugged a little, trying to settle down again. My bugs recognize him to some degree. Sume glanced at the red-haired Junin again. I don't sense malicious intent. Your bugs. Shibi remained silent for a moment before replying slowly, they seem partial to him. Sume did a double take. They like him. Shibi's frown deepened. Something has them worried. Sume tensed, hand automatically drifting down to her hip pouch. Is it this guy? Because I've never seen him before. I don't care how long a mission he's been on. I've never laid eyes on him before. Shibi glanced sharply at her. No. They are worried for him. Sume pulled up, hand dropping back to her side. What? Why? Shibi shook his head. I do not know. Before either of them could say anything more, the Junin they had been discussing turned to face them, and both took an immediate sprint down memory lane as brilliant cerulean pinned them in place. Shibi, Sume murmured without looking away from the blue-eyed Junin. Is it just me, or does this guy remind you of the Yondaime? Shibi finished gravely. He would never forget their old friend's eyes. Minato always seemed to be able to look straight into a person's soul with them, and even from this distance, Shibi got the exact same feeling from this shinobi. Are you two alright? They both blinked and tore their gazes away from the red-haired Junin to look down at their children. Kiba was blinking up at them with confusion and even Shino had raised a questioning eyebrow. We're fine, brats, Sume told them briskly. Now are you going to introduce us or not? We don't have all day. Haruki-san. Sorry to keep ya waiting. Haruki smiled down at the two boys of Team 8 as they approached, Shibi and Sume several feet behind their children. Don't worry about it. I wasn't waiting long. How are you today? Still tired from yesterday? Kiba grinned up at him. Nope. I bounce right back. And Akamaru's back to full strength too. Akamaru yipped and leapt off Kiba's head, settling in the arms that automatically came out to catch him. He liked this person. Haruki smelled like sunlight and summer and always gave him treats. And whenever Akamaru snuggled against him, some of the loneliness he could sense disappeared as well. He hoped his human visited this man more often. Kiba seemed less angry and more relaxed ever since meeting Haruki. Akamaru would have to do his best to repay him. Haruki sighed as the white pup made himself comfortable in his arms. Kiba-kun, I think there is something wrong with Akamaru. He keeps doing this. Kiba grinned even wider, baring sharp canine teeth. He just likes ya, so ya better get used to it. He's gonna be doing that a lot. Haruki just sighed again and turned to Shino. And how are you, Shino-kun? How's that new jutsu coming along? Shino nodded once. I am fine. The jutsu is difficult. I am still working on it, but I have improved the distance to 5 meters since I started making chakra threads. That is much harder to do. Haruki nodded, not missing the minuscule but sharp jerk of Shibi's head. Keep at it then. When you can extend them from all your fingers at the same time, I'll teach you how to attach them to objects so you can move them. Shino nodded back, silent again, but there was a hint of a smile peeking out from behind his collar. Haruki smiled back, amused as he watched the younger version of his friend, before finally looking up at the two adults still standing several paces away. And these are your parents then? Oh yeah. Kiba bounded back to his mother. What was wrong with her today? He didn't usually have to drag her anywhere. Maybe she was tired from her mission. This is my mum, Sume. Ka-chan. This is Haruki-san. Sume stepped forward, eyes narrowed as she studied the redhead. Haruki only smiled back and nodded a greeting. Hello, Sume-san. Kiba's talked about you. Sume arched an eyebrow. So this Junin knew not to call her by the formal honorific. Did Kiba mention that to him? Oh, what about? She knew her son. Kiba wouldn't hold back on the comments. He would have told Haruki both good and bad. Haruki tilted his head, considering the woman in front of him. He knew how to handle Sume from his time, the woman was loyal to the core, as were all Inuzukas. She appreciated honesty, no matter how harsh, and detested sugar-coated words and traitors more than anything else. So, impatient, Haruki stared steadily back at the clan head, catching the surprise that flitted across her face and ignoring the slightly nervous look on Kiba's. Short-tempered, tough, quite frightening when lecturing Kiba-kun. But your son says that's okay because he knows you love him anyway. Haruki-san. Kiba spluttered, looking embarrassed and indignant. Haruki smiled innocently down at him. You did say that, Kiba-kun. You're not supposed to repeat it to her. The younger Inuzuka sibling wailed, face red. He yelped when Sume suddenly laughed and slung an arm around his shoulders. Sume could only stare in astonishment as Haruki told her straight to her face what he had heard. Of course, it sounded just like her son, but she really hadn't expected the Junin to repeat it word for word. Most people took one look at her and quailed. Haruki looked at her without the slightest bit of apprehension. Hearing the end of Kiba's account of her, she couldn't help but bark out a laugh as a rush of affection welled up inside her. That last part she hadn't expected. Sume's fine, she told the redhead as she straightened up and offered him a sharp smile. I hear you've been teaching them. Haruki shrugged. Just for a day. Kurenai invited me. Kiba grinned proudly. It was really hard but we managed it in the end. He blinked, glancing up at Shibi as if suddenly remembering his presence before reaching over to poke his teammate. Oi. Shino. Introductions. Shino arched an eyebrow at Kiba but didn't get too annoyed. Yesterday was still fresh in his mind. He turned a little to his father instead. Otu-san. This is Haruki-san. Haruki-san. My father, Aburame Shibi. Haruki's greeting to him came just as freely as it did to Sume. Shibi nodded briefly back, noting how the Junin's gaze seemed to slice right through his sunglasses and straight to his eyes. He wanted to ask more, very out of character for him, but he wanted to know why his Kikaichu picked up such a tangled mess of emotions when all Shibi could see right now was a warm smile and a cheerful countenance. But, well, we'd like to talk more, but we haven't reported into the Hokage yet, Sume said briskly, one hand on top of Kiba's hood. Maybe later, Haruki. Haruki nodded quickly. Sarutobi would need to fill them in before he called everyone together tomorrow. Of course, I won't Ki. He stiffened and glanced to the right, as did Shibi and Sume. The children looked confused and Akamaru raised his head, sniffing the air questioningly. Ah. Haruki rubbed the back of his head. I suppose it would be bad manners to run away right now. Sume glanced curiously at him. Run away. It's just Shikaku. Man's not that bad. Granted, he could lighten up a bit but it could be worse. Haruki just heaved another sigh, stuffing his hands into his coat pockets. Ma. That's not it. He's been looking for you for the last 3 days. If I didn't know better, Haruki, I'd say you've been avoiding me. The sarcasm was thick in the Junin commander's voice and Haruki inwardly winced as he turned around to face the Nara head. Good evening, Shikaku. Shikaku stared menacingly at him, torn between wanting to wring the redhead's neck for forcing him to endure so many troublesome hours and congratulating the man for avoiding him so well. He knew Anbu couldn't hide from him, which only served to pique his curiosity even more. You are a difficult man to track down, Haruki, he finally said, frowning irritably at the redhead. Haruki tried a Kakashi-eye smile as his lips tilted up unrepentantly. Ma. I didn't want to play another round of shogi so soon. Shikaku just sighed before glancing at the newly returned clan heads standing behind the Junin. Shibi. Sume, good to see you back. He frowned again as he glanced at Haruki. They needed to be filled in soon. You need to head over to the Hokage Tower. Sandaime Sama's been expecting you. Both shinobi heard the weight in his voice and they quickly nodded. I'll see you at home, Kiba. Sume ruffled her son's hair before giving a general nod at the others and shining away. Shibi patted his son on the shoulder before following his old teammate. He would ask Shino about Haruki when he got home, and inquire about the chakra threads as well. Well, see ya later, Haruki-san. Kiba waved as Akamaru jumped back onto his head. The dog yipped as well, looking almost expectant. Haruki chuckled and reached into a pocket to withdraw a small bag of dog treats. That's it. Akamaru snapped up the treat, wagging vigorously as his best friend laughed below him. Haruki was quickly becoming one of his favorite humans. See you tomorrow. Kiba-kun, Shino-kun. Haruki glanced up at the darkening sky. Go straight home, alright. It's getting late. Both boys nodded before heading off in their compound's direction. It helped that their homes were so close to each other. Haruki watched them go before turning warily back to Shikaku. The man had watched the entire exchange quietly, content to wait Haruki out. So, Haruki began, slouching a little in his coat. You want a match? Partly. Shikaku agreed. At the moment, I mostly just want to figure you out. Haruki eyed him dryly. You'd suck as an interrogator. Shikaku shrugged easily, motioning for Haruki to join him as he headed away from the park. That's why I leave that job to Inoichi. Or Ibiki now. They walked in easy silence for a while. Despite Shikaku's desire to figure out his secret, Haruki was almost completely relaxed in this man's company. The Nara clan head wasn't all that different in the future, always a steady, solid presence that Haruki had learned to depend on. Of course, there would be no depending here, but that didn't mean that he couldn't feel comfortable around the Junin commander. Inoichi is worried about you. Shikaku started again, glancing sidelong at the redhead. Haruki nodded. I heard. I don't know why. Shikaku dearly wanted to ask, have you looked in a mirror lately, but held his tongue. You haven't been by to Yamanaka flowers either, he said instead. Haruki shrugged. Inoichi is one of your best friends. He wouldn't have let me leave until you came. Would that be such a bad thing? Shikaku asked dryly. I simply have a theory I wish to confirm. Haruki automatically scoffed, amused and nostalgic in equal parts. Of course you have a theory. A Nara without theories is a dead Nara. A slightly stilted silence followed as Haruki blinked at the odd look on Shikaku's face. Be careful with your words, Haruki, Shikaku said at last, and Haruki frowned a little as a belated alarm bell rang in the back of his mind. You have the disturbing tendency to repeat things that you shouldn't know. Haruki frowned a little more and repeated his words in his head. A Nara without theories is a dead Nara. He had heard this from Shikamaru, but it wasn't something his chief strategist had ever voiced as a kid. This time Shikamaru shouldn't have said it yet. My wife once said that to me, Shikaku revealed quietly, face half hidden in shadows as they passed under an alcove. Haruki remained stubbornly blank-faced. Before Shikamaru was born. As a joke, of course. His head tilted in a mockingly contemplative manner. But I could swear you've never met Yoshino before. Haruki walked on, refusing to acknowledge Shikaku's faint smirk and cursing himself inside his head. And of course, the Junin commander continued relentlessly. The day you trained my son and his team, you repeated my words as well. And I know I have never said them to Shikamaru, and it would be somewhat redundant to say them to someone who isn't a Nara. Strange, isn't it? In his coat, Haruki's hands clenched into fists. How the hell had their conversation deteriorated to this point so quickly? There were times that he hated this side of Shikaku. The ruthless, uncompromising shinobi who excelled at continually boxing in his target even after they were completely cornered with no way out. Even worse was that Shikaku wielded this skill like he would a piece in a shogi game, seemingly careless, outwardly effortless, and utterly destructive. In the future, Shikaku had passed this skill onto his son, and during the few times either of them had carelessly turned it on him, Haruki had been beyond pissed off. He had spent his entire childhood running, always running, and knew the pain and fear of being surrounded with no way out. It was why, when he had to kill, he almost always made sure to do it as quickly as possible. If someone was going to die either way, the terror that set in if a kill was drawn out too long was unnecessary. They were ninja, not psychopaths, though he'd seen the two combined more than once in his life. At the moment though, Haruki was facing a friend, someone he would gladly die for, and the man was playing mind games with him. Maybe he would have to retract his previous statement. Shikaku could give Inoichi a run for his money when he was like this. I've made you angry. Shikaku's sudden observation, quiet and a touch apologetic, snapped Haruki out of his thoughts but not his anger. Damn straight, he snapped back, low and dark and not bothering to hide the fury and, even after all this time, just the smallest amount of panic that roared in his chest. Either get to the point or get lost, Shikaku. Don't turn that cornering crap on me. Shikaku almost stepped back at the unveiled tangle of emotion that made Haruki's eyes blaze. Shit, he had overstepped his boundaries. It occasionally happened when he was angry or when he caught onto something interesting that kept him occupied for more than a couple days. The habit had slowly gotten better after Inoichi had taken him aside one day, years ago, after he had reduced a fellow shinobi to a shaking heap of fear for insulting Yoshino, and had warned him of the consequences of what he could so easily do. You're smart, Shikaku, Inoichi had told him, blue eyes intent. And that brain of yours is as deadly as any weapon, but you have to be careful. Say the wrong thing one too many times and you could destroy someone's mind. I don't care if you do it to enemy nin, but keep a lid on it when it comes to allies. You could seriously hurt them. And here he was, doing the exact same thing Inoichi had warned him not to do to someone that Shikaku knew didn't have the best mental health at the moment. Shit. I apologize, he said quickly, automatically raising his hands in a placating gesture when gleaming cerulean narrowed. It's a bad habit. I did not mean to turn on you like that. Haruki studied the Junin commander for a moment longer, struggling to shove his emotions back down as he did so. He took a quiet deep breath, slowly letting it out along with his anger and then immediately wishing he hadn't. Now that he was no longer angry, the heavy exhaustion from before seemed to come back in full force, settling on his shoulders like deadweight once again. What do you want, Shikaku? Haruki suppressed the urge to close his eyes. God, he just wanted to go back to his apartment and rest, maybe even risk sleeping for a few hours. Shikaku stayed silent for a long moment. A part of him wanted to just leave and call it a night. It was obvious that he had just botched their entire conversation. But a bigger part of him, the shinobi side, the strategist side, the Nara side, wanted to know. I was going to ask you for another shogi match, Shikaku spoke at last, choosing his words carefully. Just to verify some things, but I'm pretty sure I've already figured it out, so I won't. All I want right now is a confirmation. This time, Haruki did close his eyes, sighing deeply before opening them again. What exactly do you know right now? Quote. You have the Kyuubi sealed inside you, Shikaku started after making sure Haruki really did want to know. You have Namikaze Minato's eyes, and your face is a bit like his. I thought you were his brother or cousin, but I forgot to consider his wife, and you have her smile and mainly her facial structure. So I'm inclined to believe that your hair color is a henge, and you've hidden the whisker marks on your face because you can only be one person. But that should be impossible because Uzumaki Naruto is just a boy and I know you have not hanged into one or the other. You have the Hokage's ear, you repeat words that you shouldn't know, you navigate the Nara compound like a second home, and, Shikaku stopped for a heartbeat, watching the shadows creep into those sorrowful eyes again before ending softly, and apparently, you look at my son and you see someone else, someone you can't bear to look at. Whatever light that remained in Haruki's eyes flickered out and Shikaku almost wanted to take every word back as a deadened gaze stared back at him. But he had come this far, said this much, and he needed to push because if he was right, and he knew he was then Haruki needed help since there was just no way he could do everything alone, no matter how strong he was. So he continued, concluding in a gravelly voice that was barely above a murmur, one person from two different times. You are Uzumaki Naruto from the future, from a different timeline, from a world beyond repair. So you came back, to change things. Shikaku stared hard as dull blue eyes closed. Am I correct, Haruki? Haruki didn't answer him directly, only opening his eyes and turning to stare down a surprisingly empty street. The sunlight was almost completely gone by now and most people had headed home for dinner. Bodies and ashes, Haruki finally spoke, and Shikaku contained a shudder at the raw-haunted expression that finally surfaced on the redhead's face. Can you imagine Konoha reduced to nothing but bodies and ashes? And everyone dead. Everyone. Babies, children, civilians, shinobi. All gone. He turned back. Can you imagine that, Shikaku? Because, funny enough, until I saw it myself, I couldn't imagine it either. It won't happen. Shikaku was startled to hear how rough his voice had become but continued anyway, looking the time traveler in the eye. We won't let it. Haruki smiled, humorless. We, Shikaku. Yes, Shikaku frowned sternly at the Junin. I don't know what kind of person I'll become in the future. I can only speak for myself in the present. I know what's going on now. Don't think I'll let you handle this on your own, especially if Konoha's on the line. The Sandame has told Inoichi that you can't be helped, that we should simply leave you alone. I won't lie and promise you that everything will be alright. After everything you've been through, maybe you'll never completely heal, I don't know. But the Hokage is wrong to leave everything to you. We can at least try. Haruki stared at him, expression twisting a little in a way that Shikaku couldn't read. You're exactly the same, the redhead finally muttered, shoulders hunching just a bit. You wouldn't leave me or Shika alone in the future either. He glanced up, a morbid smile curling at the corners of his lips. It got you killed. Shikaku didn't blink. I'll be more careful this time around. Haruki snorted, but Shikaku felt something loosen in his gut when some of the dead expression lifted from the Junin's face and blue eyes became a little more alive again. I won't tell you everything, Haruki said at last. I might not even come close to telling you half of that. Shikaku shrugged, shoving his hands into his coat as he walked forward, unbelievably glad when Haruki didn't move away from him. That's fine. So long as you warn me of something that's about to happen so we can prevent it, I won't push anymore. Much. He added as an afterthought. Haruki let out a sound that was a half laugh, half sob. But his shoulders relaxed and he walked willingly enough beside Shikaku as they moved aimlessly down the street again. You called my son Shika, Shikaku recalled. You were good friends then. Haruki smiled a little, more genuine this time. More like brothers. I made him my chief strategist. Other chief strategist anyway. I kept you on until you, well. Shikaku nodded thoughtfully and absently wondered how he had died. Ah. Rokudaime Hokage, I assume. Haruki nodded but didn't expand on it and Shikaku didn't ask. Instead, I haven't had sake in 3 days because of you. Let's go to Shushuya. You can tell me who knows what over dinner. Haruki bit back a smile as he nodded and followed the Nara clan head to the popular restaurant. It was strange. He had thought that it would complicate matters if more people found out, had thought that maybe Shikaku would insist on knowing everything right away, but the man had never, at any point in time, rushed into things without thinking it over first. And Naras were always smart enough to know when to defer to someone else when they weren't as knowledgeable in the area. Perhaps it wouldn't be so bad then. The Sandame knew, but the Hokage could hardly sit around all day listening to tales of another time if they weren't relevant to any immediate danger. And while Hazashi knew, Haruki wasn't all that comfortable relying on someone whom he had never known in any time. But Shikaku was someone he was familiar with, even if this was a younger version of him. Haruki had properly met the Nara head when he was 15, so a couple years wouldn't make much a difference. And Shikaku was patient and a good listener and an excellent advisor. He had been a steady rock for Haruki right up until the day he died, so maybe depending on this man in this timeline was something he could do after all. Besides, it didn't look like Shikaku was going to give him much a choice anyway. XX. Shikaku heaved a tired sigh as he sat down on the wooden porch, reaching down to take off his sandals. What a night. Hyuga Hazashi was the only person other than the Sandame who knew the truth. No wonder Haruki looked so tired all the time. He doubted the Hyuga clan head's brother had been much help. Hyugas were an emotionally stunted lot. Even if Hazashi was better than the rest, he doubted that the man would ever go out of his way to take on such an emotional mess like Haruki. Shikaku. Shikaku stifled a yawn before glancing up to smile at his wife. Sorry I'm late, Yoshino. Got held up with some business. Yoshino could no doubt smell the alcohol on him, but Shikaku had always marveled at her ability to tell when he was giving a half-assed excuse and when he was serious, even when he said both in the same tone of voice. His wife only nodded before taking a seat next to him, leaning into him when he curled an arm around her waist. Can you imagine Konoha reduced to nothing but bodies and ashes? And everyone dead. Everyone. Babies, children, civilians, shinobi. All gone. Can you imagine that, Shikaku? Because, funny enough, until I saw it myself, I couldn't imagine it either. His arm tightened just a little around Yoshino and his other arm suddenly felt a little empty without his son beside him. No, he couldn't imagine it, couldn't see it at all, and God he hoped he never would. He had always known that real Kages were a rare breed of shinobi, set apart from the rest of the population, but he had always contemplated on what it was that made them different. Physical and mental strength, of course, but it couldn't just be that. Charisma and a genuine desire to protect the village and its people, but Shikaku had seen quite a few shinobi like that as well. So perhaps it was what he had seen in Haruki tonight. The will and resolve to never give up, to sacrifice not the people but himself to protect what was important. To keep on going even after everything had been destroyed. To put the people who followed him above everything else. The Shodaime had been like that, killed in the many battles of the First Great Shinobi War, but not before passing on his will of fire to the next generations of Konohagakure. The Nadaime had been that way as well, sacrificing himself to give Konoha a future in Sarutobi Hiruzen. The Sandaime had lost 2 teachers, a student, a wife, a successor, and many shinobi in the Third War, and had still come back to take up the mantle to keep the village going. And the Yondaime, of course, had sacrificed himself and both his family members to ensure Konoha's survival from the Kyubi. But his old friend would be disgusted with the very village he had protected if he ever saw his son's abysmal childhood. Shikaku, are you all right? His wife's concerned voice made him blink and he managed a small smile for her. Of course, Yoshino. I just have a lot on my mind. More theories, Shikaku. Her gentle teasing warmed his heart. He'd do anything to keep this in his life. Well, you know us, Shikaku grinned a little, repeating her words even as he recalled his earlier conversation. Naris without theories are dead Naris. Yoshino huffed exasperatedly, but her mouth curled up into a smile. Just don't think too much. You'll get frown lines if you do. She settled against him again and Shikaku turned to look up at the moon. They had a chance now. Haruki had come all the way back, 14 years into the past, and Shikaku would be damned if the same thing happened again. XX. Another day passed without further incident and Konoha went about its business per usual, but that very evening, 21 messenger birds were sent out, and 21 people received the Hokage's urgent summons to a meeting. Dinner utensils were dropped, books were set aside, training equipment was put away, and 21 shinobi from all across Konoha headed for the Hokage Tower. Chapter 8. The Hokage couldn't have called us earlier or something. Or tomorrow. I was eating dinner. Kurenai patted her irate friend on the shoulder. Enko. Sandaime-sama wouldn't have called us at this time if it wasn't important. Enko rolled her eyes but settled for sulking as they approached the Hokage's office. She had bumped into Kurenai outside the Hokage Tower and, after realizing that they had both been summoned but having no idea why, had made their way up together. As they stepped into the office, they both blinked in surprise when they saw other shinobi already assembled in the room, a bunch of chairs lined up neatly in the room. Yugo. Hayate. Enko made her way over to the small group gathered on one side of the office, Kurenai following behind her. And you 4 idiots too. What's going on? Used to her personality, they all took the insult, which was really more of an endearment, in stride and greeted the 2 kunoichi with a round of nods. Not sure. Hayate was the one to reply, straddling a wooden chair with his arms propped on the back of it. We all got here only a few minutes ago. As they pulled up chairs as well, Kurenai frowned at Hayate, studying the Kenjutsu expert closely for a long moment. There were only the faintest of bags under his eyes and his shoulders were completely relaxed for once. Hayate. Kurenai noted the other's grins with some consternation. You look better today. A lot better. Did something happen? Hayate grinned openly at her. Oh good. It really is noticeable. I just got out a few hours ago and haven't really seen anyone yet. Kurenai looked around, feeling completely lost. Guys, what's going on? Got out from where? Enko spoke up again, waving an excited hand in Hayate's direction. Ya can't tell, Kurenai. Hayate's been cured. Kurenai sat frozen in her chair, stunned as she looked from one face to another, all smiling broadly back at her. You're serious? Taking turns, Genma and Raida explained the previous day's events to her as Kurenai took it in with wide eyes. And then, Smiling in delight herself, she congratulated Hayate enthusiastically. She wasn't as close to Hayate or the others as much as Anko was, but she still considered them friends, and she was grateful to whoever it was that had managed to pull something like this from thin air. You all seem happy. What's the occasion? They all turned to see Asuma walk in, Guy following close behind. The story was repeated again with no less feeling, and Asuma smiled and clapped the Kenjutsu specialist on the back before taking a seat next to Kurenai, while Guy all but bounced in his chair, proclaiming about the wonders of youth. This continued on for several seconds before Anko shut him up with a well-placed threat to his manhood. So does anyone know what's going on? Katetsu asked as they all finally settled down. Asuma shrugged. I got a message to head to the Hokage's office, but nothing more than that. That's what the rest of us got too. Azumo nodded, leaning back in his chair. Wonder what the Hokage wants. Genma suddenly straightened, eyes focused over their heads. I'm going to guess that it has something to do with what Haruki was saying the other day. Take a look. They all turned and then hastily straightened in their seats as the 6 clan heads of Konoha filed in, with Hyuga Hazashi walking alongside his brother and Inuzuka Hana walking beside her mother. All of them glanced briefly around the office before quietly taking seats on the left side of the room. Hana exchanged a few more words with the Inuzuka clan head before rising and making her way over to them. Hana-chan, is this about the meeting with Kumo? Katetsu immediately asked as she took a seat with them. At her amused nod, he exchanged a bewildered glance with Azumo. Then what the hell are we doing here? We're Chunin. Hana shook her head. I'm not sure about the details. My mom just mentioned a summit conference with Kumogakure. But I got the Hokage's summon as well, so, she shrugged. Here I am. Footsteps at the door made them turn a third time, and the entire room rose to their feet as the Hokage walked in, Ibiki, the Anbu general, and the Anbu second a few steps behind him. Sarutobi moved to the front of the room while Ibiki veered off, stopping near the back a few feet away from Anko, arms crossed and looking as imposing as ever. The 2 masked shinobi settled similarly on the right behind the clan heads. Please sit, the Hokage called from the front, taking a seat himself behind his desk. This will take a while. Thank you for coming on such short notice. They all sat down again, attention focused entirely on Sarutobi now. The Hokage looked around before releasing a resigned sigh. It seems we're still waiting for 2 more though. He paused before glancing at Hayate. I heard about the good news, Hayate. Congratulations on the recovery. Hayate bowed his head respectfully. Thank you, Hokage-sama. Beside him, Anko piped up, Hokage-sama, do you know who gave the doctors the cure? Everyone was focused on this exchange now, even as Sarutobi inclined his head. I do, but I believe we both know he has no wish to be identified. Anko scowled, crossing her arms. Come on, Hokage-sama, even a hint would. Leave it, Anko, Genma interrupted from his seat, Senbon stuck in his mouth as usual. Whoever he is doesn't want to be known. The purple-haired Kunoichi snapped her head around to study the Senbon wielder suspiciously. From Hayate's other side, Yugo spoke up, interest clear in her voice. Do you know who it is, Genma? Genma shrugged. Just suspicions. Anko immediately glared. Well, let's hear them then. The Tokubetsu Junin grunted indifferently. I only have suspicions, Anko. Nothing concrete. And you wouldn't say anyway, would you? Raida observed dryly. He knew his friend. If Genma was being tight-lipped on purpose, no amount of prying would get anything out of him. Genma smirked around his Senbon and proceeded to ignore the dark glower Anko sent his way. A few of the clan heads had blatant interest on their faces, but none of them had time to raise their own questions before 2 voices, muffled but slowly coming closer, drew their attention to one of the office windows. Then know where I live. Only the Hokage knows where I live. I used to be a spy. I'm rather good at finding things out. Do you have any idea what this is going to do to my reputation? I'm going to give the Hokage a heart attack. I doubt the old man's gonna keel over just because you showed up only a few minutes late. Now stop complaining. We're here. A moment later, 2 shadowed figures landed on the windowsill, silver and crimson gleaming against the evening sky in the light of the Hokage's office. Hey old man, Haruki jumped inside, absently tugging his coat back in place as Kakashi followed him in. Sorry we're late. The entire room stared, speechless for several long seconds. Kakashi and Haruki exchanged a glance and before turning to stare back. It isn't that shocking, is it? Haruki finally said, exasperation leaking into his voice. He's still a few minutes late. Sarutobi was the first to speak, chuckling as he rose to his feet. True, Haruki, but it has never happened before. Haruki just grinned a little, nudging the copy nin forward. Kakashi looked as bored as ever, but there was a pleased glint in his eye as he surveyed the surprised shinobi in the room. How in the world did you do it? Kurenai voiced, astonishment clear on her face. We'd usually have to wait at least an hour before Kakashi turns up. Haruki shrugged, stepping further into the office as he glanced back at Kakashi and tipped his head towards the chairs. Wordlessly, Kakashi sauntered forward and took a seat at the end next to Asuma. I just went to pick him up. Has no one ever thought to do that? He can't exactly avoid a meeting if someone makes sure he gets here on time. No one knows where he lives, Genma pointed out, but Haruki caught a puzzlingly thoughtful look in the Senbon wielder's eyes, as if he was thinking about something else entirely as he studied the redhead. Ah, well, he lives. Haruki. The warning came from the copy nin and Haruki sighed and shrugged apologetically. Sorry, can't say. Again, the rest of the room was watching them with something akin to incredulous fascination and Haruki frowned a little before glancing at the Hokage again. Sarutobi just shook his head before coming around the desk to stand beside Haruki. Alright, let's get this meeting started. I'm sure everyone realizes that we are here to discuss the summit conference with Kumogakure. Before we start on that though, some of you still need to be filled in on the real details of what brought us to this point in the first place. He gestured to the Junin next to him. As most, if not all of you know, this is Kazama Haruki. He is the one responsible for bringing back Hyuga Hazashi. The next 10 minutes were spent giving a semi-detailed explanation of the circumstances surrounding the Hyuga clan head's brother as Haruki stood motionless under the other shinobi's sharp gazes, features blank. When Sarutobi finished, there were varied expressions on each of the room's occupants' faces. The clan heads and Hazashi already knew, but the other half of the room hadn't and was now staring at Haruki with everything from thoughtfulness to amazement. So this is why no one really seems to know you? Katetsu inquired. You haven't been back in 8 years. Haruki inclined his head, ignoring the part of his mind that admonished him for lying. It was necessary, and he didn't have time to indulge in his conscience at the moment. That's amazing, Yugo remarked, respect evident in her words. You managed to corner Kumo in less than 2 weeks and they won't even be able to accuse us of anything in this. Yes, Sarutobi agreed. Which brings us back to the point of this meeting. The conference with Kumo will consist of myself and 12 others. Haruki will be one of course, and we have come up with a list of those who will accompany me as well. The clan heads make 7, and Hazashi will make 8. There was a general round of nods from the right side of the room. Yugo and Hayate will come as well. Mild surprise flashed across Hayate's face, but he nodded a moment after Yugo inclined her head. Asuma blinked, mildly startled but straightened and nodded without pause. And Kakashi. The copy nin acknowledged this with a single nod, though his visible eye slid over to the red-haired Junin for a brief moment, calculating behind the lazy perusal. The rest of you will remain in Konoha on standby in case Kumo tries anything while I am away, Sarutobi continued before gesturing to Haruki again. One of the things we will request from Kumo is something Haruki and I came up with. I'll let him explain. Haruki nodded and took a step back, steadying the mild stir of apprehension in his stomach with relative ease. He had long since gotten used to talking in front of crowds. Right, he started, noting the attentiveness in every shinobi's expression. I'm sure you all know Uzumaki Naruto. There was a rush of murmurs around the room before Anko spoke up. He's the demon brat, isn't? The kunoichi abruptly cut herself off when cerulean eyes froze over and pinned her with an icy stare. From her right, Kakashi's typical lazy drawl wasn't so lazy anymore. There was just the slightest edge of steel underlying his voice as he spoke. Anko, that demon brat is my student. It was strange, a detached part of Anko's mind thought. Sharingan no Kakashi was famed for his detached nonchalance and cool head in any situation and often showed nothing but disinterest in everything not directly related to the immediate safety of Konoha. The man was hard-pressed to care about anything on a good day. And yet, here he was, defending one of his students for something Anko had said that she hadn't even meant as an insult. She wondered if Haruki had anything to do with this change. That's not what I meant, she snapped back, mostly at Kakashi because Haruki wasn't even frowning and she could already feel the chill trickling down her spine. She almost pitied any poor fool who pissed him off enough to receive the full brunt of that glare. I've got nothing against the kid. I can tell a child from a demon, Hitaki. Anko breathed an inward sigh of relief when Kakashi relaxed enough to eye smile and almost apology at her. She shot an irritated glare back before turning to Haruki again to check his expression. The frigid stare was gone, replaced by his typically neutral expression again. What about him then? She asked, not quite able to hide a scowl from surfacing on her face. Haruki had the decency to look apologetic for a brief moment and Anko settled back down with a huff. Well then, Haruki continued, his gaze sweeping around the room. As you know, Naruto is the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. But right now, all he knows is why this village hates him so much. Cerulean darkened to indigo as he spoke. He doesn't understand the Kyuubi's power, nor does he realize how strong he can become if he manages to work together with the fox. Wait, Asuma straightened from his seat, something like alarm flashing across his face. We don't want Naruto to use that demon fox's power. Why not? Haruki immediately countered, and several in the office noted the way his shoulders squared, as if preparing for battle. The Kyuubi's chakra is just another source of strength one can use. The Uchihas have their Sharingan, the Hyugas have their Byakugan, the Abarames have their Kikaichu, the Inuzukas have their dogs. Naruto and Kurama are no different. Working together, they could become very strong. Kurama. Asuma frowned, confused. The Kyuubi's name, Haruki answered shortly, leaving half the room looking nonplussed. If Naruto can work together with the fox, his potential would increase even more and Konoha would become that much stronger. The Kyuubi tried to destroy Konoha 12 years ago, Sum cut in flatly, eyes narrowed. I've got nothing against the brat. My own son is friends with him, but who knows what that monster would do if he could influence the boy. Haruki opened his mouth before closing it again, mentally calming Kurama as growls resonated in his mindscape. They don't know yet, he reminded the fox. Then tell them. This is degrading. Alright, Haruki said aloud, glancing sideways at the Hokage. I think I'll have to go further back and tell you something else then. Old man, you remember what I said about who was really behind the Kyuubi attack? Sarutobi nodded thoughtfully as his gaze swept over the occupants of the room. He had been told of the real mastermind behind several disasters hitting Konoha, but he suspected that there was still something Haruki was holding back from him. But the former Hokage had said nothing more on the subject, so Sarutobi had not pushed. He trusted Haruki to tell him when he needed to know. Tell them. But this is an S-class secret. Word of this must not get out. There was a general round of nods as the Chunin shifted uncertainly, glancing at each other. Why exactly were they here again? They wouldn't tell anyone of anything they heard here today, but it was rare for someone below Junin to be privy to top secret information. Okay. Haruki nodded decisively. How many of you know who Uchiha Madara is? There were several sharp intakes of breath as all the clan heads glanced sharply at one another. Shikaku kept his gaze firmly on the red-haired Junin. He had already heard about the events of the Kyuubi attack from Haruki when they had gone out for dinner the other night. Uchiha Madara was the clan head of the Uchiha clan during the Shodime's reign, right? Hayate put in slowly. He helped found Konoha, but he betrayed it in the end. He and the Shodime fought at the Valley of the End and he was killed in the battle, wasn't he? No. Haruki observed the shock that appeared on several shinobi's faces, but there were a few who only looked pensively thoughtful, as if they had suspected this all along. Uchiha Madara survived that battle. Barely. But he did, and he's still around today. Needless to say, Konoha isn't his favorite village at the moment. Madara's Sharingan has the ability to control Kurama and use him in battle. It was Madara who forced him to attack Konoha all those years ago, it was not Kurama's choice. By the time the Yondaime managed to stop Madara's influence over the Kyuubi, Kurama was already too angry to stop. Absently, twitching the senbon in his mouth, Genma glanced wryly at his friends. They looked almost catatonic with shock. Then again, he wasn't doing much better. Whatever he had been expecting in the meeting today, it was not this. In his mind, he had imagined the briefing to be something along the lines of "We will be meeting with Kumo, get your gear together, meet at the main gates, dismissed." Judging by most of the clan heads' expressions, they hadn't been expecting this either. He turned back to the front of the room, cocking his head to observe the red-haired Junin standing calmly beside the Hokage. Surely an infiltration mission to Kumo, no matter how long, wouldn't result in uncovering something of this magnitude, so how did Haruki know? He wanted to ask, but held his tongue. There was something off about Haruki's background, and he wasn't sure if the questions he wanted to voice would put him in a difficult position. As it turned out, Genma needn't have worried. Someone else posted the question before he could contemplate it any further. "Wait, you got all this in an infiltration mission to Kumo?" Sume demanded, not understanding the heavy frown that Shikaku suddenly directed her way. "Does that mean they know this stuff?" No, Haruki shook his head. "I'm good at finding things out, and I've done a little digging while I was away." It was clear that Sume was not satisfied with this answer, but Shikaku spoke up before she could probe further, focusing everyone's attention back to the main point. "Then we know to keep an eye out for Uchiha Madara. But what does the Kyuubi and Naruto have to do with the conference with Kumo?" Haruki nodded. "The Kyuubi is not just a mindless beast. He has his own thoughts and, in his right mind, would only attack places where human malice has collected and festered, since his ability is to detect negative emotions. If Naruto gets in touch with the fox, Kurama could be convinced to work together with Naruto. And if that happens, someone will have to teach him how to wield the Kyuubi's chakra. That's where Kumo comes in. During the conference, we will most likely agree to a diplomat from Kumo to come live in Konoha as a sign of continued peace between our two villages." Haruki withdrew 2 scrolls and unraveled them, showing the audience a depiction of the 2 shinobi he was about to introduce. This, he held up the scroll in his right hand, is the Raikage's adoptive brother, Killer B. I believe he's powerful enough to be Anbu level, but he is named the guardian of Kumogakure since, in addition to being their Kage's family, he is also the Jinchuriki of Gyuki, the Hachibi. Ignoring the startled gasps from his captivated listeners, Haruki held up the scroll in his left hand. "And this is Niyugito, a Junin-level kunoichi and a good strategist, as well as one of the Raikage's most trusted. She's the Jinchuriki of Matabi, the Nibi." Haruki paused and scanned the room, wondering if that had been one too many surprises in the last half hour. 2 Jinchurikis. Kurenai finally voiced faintly. "But, we've never heard of any of this before." Haruki shrugged, rolling up the scrolls again. "Kumo doesn't go around proclaiming it to the world, though they don't exactly hide it either. And it isn't as if either of them uses their Biju's chakra every time they enter a fight. They're both quite strong on their own. One of them can train Naruto in the beginning steps of contacting Kurama." "Are you saying that they can fully control their Bijus?" Inoichi inquired, blue-green gaze unwavering as he stared back at Haruki. Haruki nodded. "Very well too. Both of them are quite adept at working together with their Bijus." A mirthless crooked smile flitted across his features. "They are 2 of their village's most prized shinobi. Kumo's pride, you could say." The red-haired Junin's tone wasn't quite accusing, more reproachful than anything else, but several of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Haruki ignored this and focused on the gathered clan heads instead. "I'd like the clan heads to agree to this plan before we go ahead with it." A short silence followed and Haruki forced himself to stay still. It wouldn't do to look too eager. "I agree to this plan," Shikaku suddenly spoke up, cutting the tension in the air. Inoichi and Chusa both turned to blink at him, mildly startled. It wasn't like the Junin commander to acquiesce so easily without going over everything several times first. Shikaku paid them no mind, continuing evenly, "If Naruto can fully harness the Kyuubi's power, it would be beneficial to Konoha, and perhaps even turn the people's views of him to something more positive. Though I believe Naruto to be quite loyal to this village, What with his eagerness to become a Konoha shinobi, having almost the entire population against him is a disservice to both him and ourselves, not to mention it is downright shameful to treat the boy so badly when he is holding back the Kyuubi for us. And whether we like it or not, the fox, though dormant, could one day break free of its seal. Since that is a possibility, I'd much rather have the fox on our side than against us. Thoughtful murmurs swept the room as Haruki shot the Nara head a discreet look of thanks. Shikaku gazed back calmly, tilting his head in a minuscule nod. He had meant what he said 2 nights ago, he wouldn't leave the time traveler to fend for himself anymore. Although he would have to pull the redhead aside later and maybe lecture him a bit about giving him the full details before telling anyone else. He could have come up with an even stronger defense had he had time. Well, if that's the case, I agree with Shikaku, Inoichi nodded at Haruki. I'd much rather fight beside Kurama, was it? I'd much rather fight beside him than against him if it comes to that. And the boy deserves a break from the things the villagers say. Maybe if they see that he can work with the Kyuubi, they'll be more open to his presence in Konoha. Chusa wasn't far behind as he nodded in agreement. It was widely known and accepted that one concession from their clans really meant 3. Agreed. Konoha would be much stronger with a Biju on our side, and Naruto-kun would benefit from this as well. Near the back, Hiashi glanced at his twin, raising a questioning eyebrow. He had already accepted that Hisashi knew something about Haruki that he didn't. Like how the Junin seemed to know so many things that he really shouldn't, he didn't believe for a moment that Haruki had just picked it up by doing a little digging, and usually turned to his brother in cases like this. It sounds like a good plan, he commented in a low voice as he studied Hisashi's expression. What do you think? Hisashi just smiled and inclined his head. I think it is a good plan as well. Naruto working with the Kyuubi would greatly benefit Konoha. Hiashi nodded, shooting an exasperated look at his twin for the unhelpful agreement. He had been hoping for a hint to the mystery surrounding Haruki, at the very least. Turning to face forward again, he spoke up, I agree as well. But whoever is chosen should be closely watched. Of course, Haruki nodded. That would go for anyone coming to the village as a diplomatic envoy. Soon listened to the other clan head's agreement before glancing impatiently at Shibi. Well, she asked in a lowered voice. What do you think? Shibi glanced sidelong at his former teammate and raised an eyebrow. Soon rolled her eyes. Sometimes, she wondered when she had managed to pick up enough patience to dissect an Abarame's silent speech. A raised right eyebrow alone had 36 different meanings, she had counted. This one meant why are you asking me? Because I think it's a good idea, but I'm not just gonna pitch headfirst into this like everyone else is doing today, Sue muttered back. I mean, since when does that stick up his ass Hyuga agree so easily to anything? This time, Shibi frowned at her, which had 52 different meanings, a minute crease in his brow that was only noticeable to someone looking for it. Soom huffed in irritation. You got used to my language a long time ago. Concentrate on the important thing here, Shibi. Shibi finally sighed, and even Soom had lost count of how many meanings that could amount to. She had given up after 94 and had simply memorized the sounds instead, and said curtly, I agree with this plan. It is sound, and advantageous to Konohagakure. Soom nodded, suppressing a sigh of her own as she turned back to the front. Personally, she had no objections, and if even Shibi agreed, she would support this plan fully. But still, there was something bigger here. Something someone in the room must know and wasn't telling, and Haruki was smack in the middle of it. We agree too, she called out bluntly. But I'd like a general idea of each one of them before deciding who to pick. Haruki nodded, mentally releasing a relieved sigh. Soom and Shibi had been his biggest worries. He hadn't interacted with them very much in this timeline and wasn't sure if his plan would be enough to put aside the suspicions that he knew they both had of him. Great. Then, Haruki turned to look at Kakashi. We'd need to work out some sort of deal with Kumo first, and in this case, Kakashi would get the last word in Naruto's training. The copy nin lifted an eyebrow at this, gaze flickering briefly to the Hokage and then moving on to focus on Shikaku before returning to Haruki again. He had been annoyed when a spark of betrayal had stirred inside him after catching the unsurprised expression on the Nara head's face once Haruki had revealed the mastermind behind the Kyuubi attack, as well as the short exchange between them after Shikaku had defended the redhead's plan, and it was still nagging insistently at the back of his mind right now. With hidden irritation, he shoved it down and concentrated on the matter at hand. What did it matter if Haruki had told Shikaku first anyway? It certainly didn't concern him. The Nara head had probably finally caught up to the redhead and had managed to worm a straight answer out of Haruki. Whoever trains Naruto will have to do it while I'm there as well, he said instead, voice light. And my other two students will have to know about Naruto's circumstances too. Haruki nodded immediately. Of course, but whether or not you tell them about the Kyuubi should be up to Naruto. He should be the one to choose whether or not they should know. Kakashi inclined his head in acquiescence. That sounds fine. I'll take it up with him after the conference. Haruki nodded again. His younger counterpart would most likely want his teammates to know, nervous though he'd be, but he was sure both Sakura and Sasuke would take it in stride. Alright then. Moving on, Haruki turned back to the crowd in general. I'll give you an overview of Killer Bee first. He pulled out a small booklet that he had spent a few hours filling up with all the things he could remember about the allies and enemies he had had in his former life. Killer Bee is very proud of his own powers, so the first thing to remember during the summit is to not insult his Biju. Like Naruto can be at times, Killer Bee can be quite cocky and stubborn, especially in terms of his own strength, and he demands respect from others and asks to be called Jinchuriki-sama, and his Biju be called Hachibi-sama. Haruki paused and glanced up. The entire room looked to be in a unified state of incredulity. Smothering laughter, he continued his summarization. He has a special way of expressing his pride through song, more specifically in rap style. Oh, and he'll even write his rhymes in the middle of a fight, or during an important meeting, even if they're no good, which is usually the case, so just go along with it. Haruki looked up again. The incredulity had turned into the beginnings of traumatized disbelief. Kakashi was glancing between the booklet Haruki was reading out of and Guy. The taijutsu specialist was the only one who seemed to be completely at ease with Killer Bee's description. Still trying not to snicker, Haruki returned to his report. Bee doesn't respect anyone who makes fun of rap or his lyrics, so in other words, don't laugh, or mouth off to him, or do anything to offend him if you want to work out a deal to bring him back to Konoha. For his battle skills, he's not the type of person to work with strategies with other people. He was already completing missions that were supposed to be assigned for both him and his brother, without the Raikage's knowledge. The only person B will listen to is the Raikage, since he's the only one able to keep him in check. B knows talent when he sees it though, and he respects those with it. A good example would be his fellow Kumo Jinchuriki, Yugito. He really looks up to her for her abilities. B has a very close relationship with his older brother, and the reason behind him becoming a Jinchuriki in the first place was for the sake of the Raikage. He didn't complain, and he's always cheerful and determined, much like Naruto is. However, even though he sounds pretty hot-headed, when someone close to him is in danger, he has no qualms about putting himself at risk to save them, if necessary. As far as I know, he has a pretty good relationship with Gyuki. They don't have any problems working with each other, and both of them are damn strong by themselves. As far as abilities go, B's good at taijutsu and kenjutsu, and he has the ability to flow lightning-natured chakra through his blades to increase their cutting power. Haruki stopped for a moment. He was very familiar with B's skills, but he wasn't quite sure if they reached the level he knew them to be yet. Never underestimate his ability with Raiden techniques, he said at last. He's a monster with them. He scanned his book. He has full control over his Biju, and he's the only living Jinchuriki who can retain his full Biju form indefinitely. He paused again, hesitating for a moment. Though when I say control, Haruki clarified. B and Gyuki are more like partners than anything else, which makes them even stronger in battle. Anyway, B's also kind and compassionate, so he'd probably make a pretty good teacher for Naruto if we go with him. Haruki looked up once more as he finished, studying his audience for a reaction. Most looked a little stunned at the summary of Killer B's abilities, but surprisingly, it was Kakashi who spoke first. So basically, Kakashi said in an oddly neutral voice. This Killer B, with his rapping and lyrics and whatever else he's got, is the meta guy of Kumogakure. It wasn't a question, but Haruki contemplated it for a moment before nodding somewhat cautiously. He supposed, in terms of, well, eccentricities, that was true. I guess so, yeah. I see. Kakashi raised one hand, deadpanning. I don't care who she is, I vote for the woman. This set off an immediate chain reaction. Beside him, both Asuma and Kurenai raised their hands as well and chorused, seconded. As too, Yugo, Hayate, Katetsu, Azumo, Anko, Raida, and Hana's hands all shot up. There was a distinct pause as everyone blinked. Guy looked mildly offended. I think Killer Bee-san is extremely youthful, he announced, much to the visible annoyance of Kakashi. I would not mind such youthfulness in Konoha. You wouldn't, Kurenai sighed. What do the clan heads think? Inoichi chuckled but turned back to Haruki. Let's hear about the other one first. Haruki nodded and flipped a few pages. Right, Ni Yugito. She's a hard worker, proud, wise, and a courageous kunoichi. I hear she's also firm and decisive in battle, and thoughtful of her teammates as well. She's younger than Killer Bee, but, like I said before, he looks up to her for her skills. She's a decent strategist, and better at close-ranged combat. Because of the Nibi, she can grow her fingernails and toenails into claws, and she uses fire against her enemies very efficiently. She has the ability to fully transform into the Nibi while keeping her mind, and while she doesn't have complete control over Matabi, she can control the transformation and how much of the Nibi's chakra she wants to use. Clapping his book closed, Haruki scanned the room. Obviously, I don't have as much on her as I do Killer Bee, but from what I gathered, she sounds like a pretty good candidate as well. She sounds like a good all-rounder, Shikaku commented. Killer Bee may be very strong, but he sounds like more of an offensive type. And we want someone strong, not overly strong, Sum agreed. This Yugito sounds like the best option. Murmurs swept the group of clan heads while the Hokage glanced at Haruki. Who do you want here? Haruki shrugged, making sure to keep his voice low enough so not to be overheard. I don't really mind either one. Naruto would probably butt heads with Killer Bee at first, but then again, he butts heads with most new people. Yugito's the calmer of the two though, and Bee is. He trailed off, eyes glazing over a little as memories with that particular Jinchuriki surfaced. Sarutobi frowned a little with concern. You two were friends. Haruki stirred, shrugging again. Allies. Friends, we were on pretty good terms. His mouth twisted a little. He saved my life. Sarutobi observed him for a few seconds. He sounds like a good man. Haruki scoffed. Drove me crazy sometimes. And he was crazy. Jumping in front of, he cut himself off before his shoulders slumped a little. He died. To save me, he finished lamely. Sarutobi said nothing. There really was nothing to say. It wasn't anyone's fault if one ninja died to save another, but there would always be a part of the survivor that would never let go of the guilt that came with it. We've agreed on Ni Yugito, Shikaku announced. She seems more disciplined than Killer Bee as well, which would probably be good for Naruto. Haruki quirked an enquiring eyebrow at this. What exactly are you implying here? Eyes could laugh, and Haruki knew the Nara head was mocking him right now. With a mental snort, Haruki straightened and nodded. All right then, I'm finished here. Old man. Sarutobi stepped forward again. The summit conference will be held tomorrow at 9 in the morning, in the forested area outside of Yugakure. I expect those who are coming to be at the village gates by 5, and those who aren't to be in position at that time as well. He paused and the occupants of the office took this as a cue to nod. Sarutobi continued, I will also need a sweep patrol to head out in front of the rest of us. Kumo will likely do the same. Any volunteers? I'll do it, Haruki offered immediately. He didn't know what kind of reaction he would have when he saw Bee and Yugito again. Better to catch sight of them first without a group of ninja around him. Sarutobi nodded, expecting as much. Pick someone to go with you, Haruki. Not the clan heads though. Haruki's gaze, to his belated puzzlement, jumped straight to Kakashi before Sarutobi had even finished talking, eyes already asking before he could open his mouth. He blinked when he thought he caught a pleased glint flash through Kakashi's lone eye. Well, Haruki prompted more grumpily than he had intended. Distantly, he noted that the entire room had leaned forward with interest again. Kakashi seemed to ponder his request before smiling at him and holding out a hand. Haruki understood instantly and scowled. No. Kakashi didn't look all that concerned, lowering his hand again. Then no, he countered easily. Haruki scoffed, crossing his arms. I don't need you to come with me. I could take Asuma then. Asuma put up his hands, already wary. Oh no, I'm not getting into whatever this is. Kakashi's smirk widened behind his mask. Well then, it looks like you don't have much a choice. Haruki's scowl deepened. This is blackmail. Kakashi snorted. That's rich, coming from you. You've been doing the same thing for days. Sacrifice is good for the soul. Haruki retorted crossly. I could say the same thing, Kakashi said cheerfully. Haruki glowered at him. Seconds ticked by as the two ninja waited in a stalemate. The rest of the room waited to see who would capitulate. Finally, Haruki sighed and Kakashi's expression turned triumphant. He raised his hand again. Fine. Haruki pulled out an orange book from his vest, much to the astonishment of everyone watching. But if you pull this or any other volume out at any time during the summit, I'll show you just how creative my seals can get. Kakashi huffed but nodded reluctantly. Deal. I'll even leave it at home. He gleefully tucked his precious Ika away before turning to a bemused-looking Sarutobi. So, Haruki and I for scouting tomorrow. When should we leave? Sarutobi shook his head, half amused, half exasperated. Since when did Hitaki Kakashi act so childishly? 4:30. You'll start out half an hour before us. Report back before we reach our destination. Kakashi inclined his head along with Haruki and the meeting came to an end. Most of them filed out the door, stealing shrewd glances behind them as Kakashi and Haruki headed for the window and leapt out into the night. Hitaki's finally lost it, Anko muttered, shaking her head. He's more relaxed and not as distant, Kurenai corrected. I'm glad he's found someone to relate to. Anko rolled her eyes, not quite able to hold her tongue. Yeah, and next thing you know, he'll be handing out sweets to civilian children. What is the world coming to? That's it for this part. If you enjoyed it, then like, share and subscribe for the next video as it's going to be more interesting, and also check out my other playlists. Hope you would like them too.